Isis Audio presents an unabridged recording of A Taste of Home, written by Heidi Swain and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Isis Audio. Chapter 1. The sun had long since set over the Italian horizon before the last of the mourners finally headed back to their homes, leaving behind a mountain of food and a silence in the farmhouse kitchen that neither the Rossi family nor I could bear to acknowledge. No one's eyes strayed to Mum's much-loved patterned Moroccan shawl draped over the chair next to the stove, or to her collection of thin gold and silver bangles bundled together in a box on the table amid the crockery and cutlery. Early that morning, I had thought I might wear them to her funeral, but when it came to it, I couldn't. "I don't think I can do this," I had sobbed, pulling them off again when it was time to leave for the church, but I wasn't talking about wearing her jewellery. "I'm not ready." I had watched Mum's last breath leave her body, and yet somehow I still couldn't believe that she was gone. I didn't want to believe that she was gone. We might have spent more time apart than together, more hours sparring than hugging, but the thought of never seeing her again, never having another spirited cross word, wrenched my heart in two. I had tried to make myself believe that she was travelling again, off on one of her adventures, but the image of her final moments was imprinted on the inside of my eyelids, and that made the pretence impossible. "You will never be ready, darling Fleece," Nonna had said, her eyes as swollen from crying as mine, as she gently took my hand and guided me out the door into the spring sunshine, and then to the waiting car. "Not for this." Nonna's diminutive figure had been by my side all day. She had led me through the service, walked me to the graveside, and afterwards found me a seat and another plate of food back in the kitchen, which had bulged with Rossi relatives, all wanting to pay their respects. She was watching me even now, from the far side of the room. I quickly got up and began covering dishes and rearranging chairs, not wanting to worry her further. "Fleece," said Alessandro, Nonna's son, the dear man who considered Mum his sister even though they hadn't shared a single drop of blood. "Leave that." "But it needs doing," I replied, my voice every bit as hoarse as his. "The food needs to be put away at least." There were no dishes to wash. The many friends and relatives had made sure of that. Practically nothing had been left for the family to do aside from grieve for my mother, the woman who had arrived at their door, a pregnant teenager, all alone in the world almost 3 decades ago. Without question, they had welcomed her in, given her a home, and taken her to their hearts, and now they mourned her passing every bit as gravely as if she had been one of their very own. "It can wait," Alessandro kindly said. "I need to give you this." "What is it?" I asked, turning to face him. "Una lettera," he said, holding out a white envelope. "A letter?" I swallowed. "For me?" I never got mail at the farm. I had no one to write to me in Puglia. Everyone in the world I loved was right here. Except for Mum. I swallowed hard, pushing the thought of her final destination away. "It's from your mother." My eyes flicked from the envelope to Alessandro's careworn face, and I bit my bottom lip to stop it trembling. I couldn't have more tears to shed. It surely wasn't possible for my body to produce another single one. "She wrote me a letter?" I croaked. "You know your mamma," he shrugged, the tiniest smile on his lips. "She always liked to have the last word." I slid the envelope into my skirt pocket, and minutes later, having grabbed a coat and lantern from the porch and made sure Nonna was looking the other way, I slipped out of the house and made my way down to the cherry orchard. It was chilly, even for April, and I turned up the collar of the coat and walked a little faster. The letter sat heavy in my pocket. almost as heavy as the weight which had settled on my chest the moment Mum had returned to the farm after cutting her last trip short. Footloose and fancy-free, there were few corners of the globe she hadn't visited, and she had planned to be away for months. When she turned up again just a few weeks later, we knew something was wrong. Just one glimpse at her unusually pale and painfully thin face told us something was seriously amiss. The doctor confirmed our fears, and the cancer rampaging through her system had claimed her before any of us had even started to take the diagnosis in. "Oh, Mum," I sobbed as I came to a stop at the foot of one of the oldest cherry trees on the farm. I rested my back against the trunk and slid down, coming to a bump on the hard ground. I tugged the envelope out of my pocket and arranged the lantern so I could read what was inside. The writing didn't look much like Mum's. It was spidery, obviously scribbled before her strength had left her and she couldn't even hold up her head, let alone control a pen. I pushed the image away. I didn't want to think of her like that. She had always been so vibrant and full of energy, that was what I needed to remember. Even though the words didn't look like hers, the tone was unmistakably Mum's. I could imagine her standing over me and I could hear her voice in my head. "This can't be true," I whispered into the evening air as I scanned the page. "I can't believe it." "It is," came her swift response, clear as the night sky and carried on the chilly breeze. "You must." I looked at the letter again. "Fliss, I have something to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago, but I could never find the words. I know it will come as a shock, and I hope you can forgive me." I could tell the letter had been hastily written, as if she wanted to commit her confession to paper before she changed her mind or ran out of time. "Do you remember when you told me you didn't want to travel with me anymore, that you'd seen enough of the world and that you wanted to stay at the farm because it was where your roots were planted?" I did remember saying that, and mostly because of her reaction. Rather than laugh my words off, as I had expected her to, in her free-spirited, I-refuse-to-be-tethered kind of way, she had been upset. I had always assumed she was disappointed that I wasn't going to carry on following in her flighty footsteps, but apparently not. "The truth is, I stayed away for so long after that because I was feeling guilty. I know you will roll your eyes at that because you've always said I'm too self-absorbed to feel bad about anything." I wasn't rolling my eyes. Far from it. But I did feel awful, and that's because I have kept something from you, Fliss. I have kept something important from you and the Rossis. Your roots shouldn't be planted here in Puglia because you have family elsewhere. I know I've always maintained it's just the two of us in the world, but it isn't. It never has been. When I left the UK in search of your father, I left my family behind. I never got on with my dad, but I think you might. I think you might be a better fit for the family farm than I was too. I think your roots should be there, Fliss, buried in the British fenland soil, not planted here in Italy where I put them. I know I'm not in a position to make demands, but I think you should go to the farm and see it for yourself. It's called Fenview Farm, and it's near a town called Winbridge. Go and find it before you finally settle on your place in the world. I'm sorry I never told you any of this before, and I'm sorry there's no time now to tell you more. I hope you can forgive me. I'm not sure I can forgive myself. With all my love, Mum. Kiss, kiss, kiss. I stared at the letter, my hands shaking with more than the cold. Countless times both Mum and Nonna had recounted how she had arrived at the farm, pregnant, and looking for the boy she had had a holiday romance with. The address he had given her didn't exist, but the Rossis did, and they had taken her in. Their farm became ours. It was where I belonged. Or at least, it was where I had always believed I belonged. I had never given a thought to what Mum's life had been before Puglia. But now I knew she had grown up on a farm in England that bore the Brown name, and she had left it behind, along with her family, and I felt shocked to my very core. She must have fled under one hell of a cloud if it had stopped her going back. "Felice!" The sudden voice, cutting through the silence, made me jump. I almost dropped the letter and pulled in a lungful of air. I hadn't realised I was holding my breath. "Felice!" bawled the voice again. It was Marco, Alessandro's son, Nonna's handsome grandson. The man I thought of as my brother. We had grown up on the farm together. I had been there for him when he lost his mama, and now he was here for me as I tried to navigate my way through saying goodbye to mine. "I'm here," I shouted back, making the dogs in the yard bark. "Sbrigati! I'll be there in a minute. It's time to eat." The long day had been punctuated by nothing but crying and eating. In fact, the whole of the last few days had been an exhausting mix of the two. I really didn't think I could manage to do more of either. "Sbrigati!" came Marco's demand again. "I am hurrying," I muttered, trying to slip the letter back into my pocket, and only then realising that there was another slightly smaller envelope inside the first. "What are you doing out here?" Marco asked, his voice closer as he negotiated the path I had taken through the trees, aided by the torch on his phone. "It's too cold." "I just wanted a minute," I sniffed, my eyes quickly scanning the second envelope, which had the request, "Please pass on when you arrive," scribbled on the back. Mum obviously expected me to deliver her missive, but that wasn't going to happen. I wouldn't be going to Fenview Farm or to Windbridge. I had no need of another family, even if they were my flesh and blood. My home and my heart were here in Puglia with Nonna, Alessandro and Marco. "What have you got there?" Marco asked. I shook my head. "Sorry," he said. "It's none of my business." "It's fine," I told him, pushing the letter further into my pocket but not wanting to shut him out. "It's a letter. From Mum." "What does it say?" "Nothing important," I lied, holding out my hand so he could pull me up. He stared down at me, his eyes searching mine. "It really is nothing," I swallowed. Arm in arm, we set off back towards the house. Even though we were all used to Mum being away for months at a time, there was no deluding ourselves that she was coming back. As much as I would have loved to, I couldn't erase the memory of the last couple of months any more than I could pretend that her letter wasn't sitting on the nightstand next to my bed. I felt her absence everywhere. It was the last thing I thought of before I tried to sleep, and the first thing I remembered when I woke from the hours spent tossing, turning, and dreaming. As the days slowly passed, and even though I tried not to because my life really didn't need further disruption, I began to think more about the words she had left behind and the implications they could have if I acted on them. The internet at the farm was intermittent at best, which was frustrating because, as my thoughts strayed more and more often to what this Fenview Farm and Windbridge looked like, it couldn't maintain a consistent enough connection to satisfy my curiosity. I had been adamant the day of Mum's funeral that the Rossis were all the family I needed and that I wasn't going to share with them what she had revealed, but my inquisitiveness had slowly got the better of me, just as Mum had known it would. What sort of farm was it, I wondered? And more to the point, why did she think that I would be a better fit for it and her father than she had been? Within a fortnight I was fit to burst and couldn't keep the details of the letter secret any longer. I had made up my mind that I would go. I would take a flight to the UK and find the previously unheard-of family and farm for myself. If nothing else, the trip would take me to a place where I wouldn't constantly be reminded that Mum had left me for good. "So," I said, carefully laying the letter on the kitchen table after supper one evening, "I need to talk to you all. I have something to tell you." Grandmother, son, and grandson sat in silence, but each became increasingly wide-eyed as I read what Mum had written. Their expressions told me that they had absolutely no idea there was a Brown family back in England missing their daughter. When I had finished, I slowly drank my coffee, letting the words settle and sink in. I knew it would have pained Mum to know that I would have to share her secret. To the Rossis, nothing was more important than family. They were the classic Italian famiglia, and she would have worried about lowering herself in their adoring estimation. But she needn't have. They were shocked, but not unkind.
"Almost 30 years,
Alessandro quietly said.
She left England almost 30 years ago, and she never breathed a word about growing up on a farm or about her family."
I know. I nodded.
"I suppose we all just assumed that she had no one,"
he said, shaking his head.
"No one who would miss her anyway. But this,"
he said, pointing at the letter,
"suggests otherwise, doesn't it?"
Yes, I agreed. I think it does.
"Has she been in touch with them at all in all that time?"
I don't think so. I swallowed. I don't even know if she told them she was pregnant before she left, so they might not even know I exist. Alessandro ran a hand through his thick salt and pepper curls. Marco chewed his thumbnail, and Nonna stared at the letter.
"How old would that make your grandparents, Fliss?"
Alessandro frowned.
"Pretty old," Marco haphazardly calculated before I could answer. "Perhaps as old as Nonna. What are you going to do, Fliss?"
"She's going to go, of course," Nonna firmly answered, finally finding her voice.
"Yes,"
Alessandro added.
"Fliss, you must."
They sounded as though they were all set to try and convince me, but I'd already decided.
"But we're Fliss's family," Marco cut in. "What was Jennifer thinking, dropping this bombshell from beyond the grave? Why did she wait?"
"Probably so she didn't have to deal with all this," I answered, with a wry smile. Marco reached across the table for my hand and squeezed it tight.
"She shouldn't have said anything at all,"
he frowned.
"Yes," said Nonna, "she should."
"I'll come with you then,"
Marco added, having taken a moment to absorb Nonna's pronouncement. "No," I said, "you're needed here, and besides, this is one journey I really feel as though I need to make on my own." Alessandro and Nonna exchanged a look, clearly relieved that I didn't need talking around.
"Are you going to contact your grandparents before you go?" Marco asked.
"I wouldn't know what to say," I shrugged, my heart fluttering at the thought of having to find the words.
"I suppose it would be difficult to explain in a letter or on the telephone,"
said Alessandro, sucking his bottom lip as he looked down at Mum's spidery words. "And I don't want to overthink it," I told them. "Now I've made up my mind, I just want to go. I'll think about what I'm going to say when I get there. It's the only way to make sure I don't talk myself out of doing it. One step at a time. You know?"
"One step at a time," Marco repeated.
"When will you leave?"
Nonna asked, her eyes filled with tears. "At the end of the week," I told her. "I'll book a flight for Friday." She nodded and reached for my other hand, and just like that, the course of my life completely changed direction. Chapter 2. My worldly goods didn't amount to all that much, and when I sorted through Mum's things, it transpired that she had amassed even less. Aside from her bangles, her other possessions were staying at the farm, and I packed the little I needed to take with me into my capacious rucksack and carry-on bag. Materially, I didn't have a lot to show for 28 years of living, but my heart had always been full, and that was all that mattered to me.
"I don't understand why you're taking so much."
Marco sulked the morning I was set to leave, even though he could clearly see I was taking very little.
"It's not as if you won't be coming back, is it?"
"Don't worry," I said, pulling him into a hug. "You're not getting rid of me for good."
"I should hope not,"
he said, squeezing me tight.
"The season starts soon, and you need to be here to organize the troops." That's still your job, you know.
Inspired by how Mum had worked on various farms around the world to fund her happy-go-lucky lifestyle, the Rossi farm was set up to welcome travellers who wanted to stay and immerse themselves in local life for a while, rather than whiz through, barely taking in the sights before moving on. Everyone worked and lived together over the summer months, and even though each year welcomed a different mix of people, the atmosphere was always the same, inclusive and a lot of fun. From mid-May to late October, the farm buzzed, and we all preferred it to the quieter months of winter. I know it is, I smiled, amused that Marco was using my role at the farm to mask how much he was going to miss me. And I'll probably be back even before the first lot arrive.
Probably?
He asked, pulling away, his eyebrows raised.
Stop pressuring her, Marco, said Alessandro. She'll be as long as it takes. Felice, we need to go.
He took my bags out to the truck, and I swallowed down the lump in my throat. I wasn't sure I could handle saying goodbye to Nonna.
Here,
she said, holding out a sheet of paper.
This is for you.
What is it? I asked.
Read it and see.
I only took in the 4 words written at the top before my throat closed up and my vision blurred. Copied straight out of her ancient handwritten family cookbook, it was the Rossi cherry and almond tart recipe. I had been asking her for it for years, but she had always refused to give me the exact details. The particulars were a closely guarded family secret. Not even Alessandro and Marco were privy to the extra ingredient, which she only ever added when no one else was in the kitchen.
Wherever you end up,
she shakily said,
this will always give you a taste of home.
I let out a steadying breath and nodded.
I'll keep it safe,
I huskily promised, carefully folding and tucking it into the breast pocket of my shirt, alongside Mum's 2 letters. Together they felt like a protective talisman close to my heart, and I was in no doubt of the honour Nonna had bestowed upon me by handing the treasured recipe over.
And you only add the last ingredient when no one is watching,
she sternly reminded me. Of course. I smiled, bending to give her one last hug. This departure from the farm felt very different to when Mum was dragging me off somewhere. It felt unsettlingly final, not as though I would never be coming back, rather that when I did, things would be altered for good. The journey from Puglia to Peterborough wasn't all that long, but by the time I checked into the hotel where I was staying for my first night on UK soil, I felt exhausted. I briefly video-called the farm to let everyone know I was safe, and then, refusing to give in to the bout of homesickness the sight of the familiar kitchen aroused, I indulged in a long hot bath. Still with no real idea of where I was going to end up the next day, but knowing I had come far enough not to change my mind, I snuggled down in the comfortable double bed and began to Google. Fenview Farm, I said aloud as I typed the name into the search bar. Winbridge. There was no website for the farm or social media presence, and Google Street View offered up little more than a view of a fenland drove road, flat and far-reaching, but the land on either side of it appeared to be full of orchards. I hadn't given much thought to what sort of farm Fenview might be, but looking at the landscape, a fruit farm felt likely. My heart skittered at the thought. The acres of trees would provide a setting I could relate to, and there was some comfort in that. Perhaps that was why Mum considered it a match for me. But why hadn't it been for her? I could see that most of the trees looked to be well tended, but there were a couple of areas which were either neglected or altogether abandoned. The exact spot on the road where the farm was located was obscured by a row of silver birches, so I couldn't see much. But from what I could make out, it looked to be a proper working farm. It pained me to think that Mum had never once mentioned it. She had worked her way around numerous farms over the years, but she had never shared a single detail about the one which was owned by her family. Why exactly was that? My mind started to race again, in spite of my efforts to stop it before, and, knowing I was in danger of undoing all the good my relaxing bath had done, I quickly put my phone down and turned off the light, before I worked my way up to a panic. Saturday was a warm, soft spring day, and practically as soon as the bus left Peterborough, I became mesmerised by the landscape. Parts of Puglia were flat, but nothing like the fens. The vast fields stretched all the way to the horizon, occasionally interrupted by a distant copse or boundary-defining ditch. But beyond that there appeared to be nothing. Or there was nothing until we reached the outskirts of Winbridge. Then the orchards began. Acre upon acre of rows of flat-topped trees, many laden with frothy bursting blossom, were planted along both sides of the road, just as I had seen on Google. My heart soared at the sight, and I wondered if there would be as much of a spectacle waiting to welcome me to Fenview Farm. I hoped the discarded orchards I had seen online didn't belong to the place. That really would be too sad. But more to the point, would there be a welcome for me at Fenview Farm? For the first time since I had decided to come, I felt a real rush of nerves. It was more intense than what I had felt the night before, and it stamped all over practically every other emotion I had recently experienced. I began to feel nauseous. Was I making a mistake? Why did Mum think that me coming here was so important when she herself had left almost 30 years ago without a backwards glance? She had written that I would be a better fit for the place, but were she and I really so different?
"This is as far as I go," said the bus driver, as he twisted round to look at me from his seat and pulled me out of my reverie. "Are you getting off or going back?" He didn't know it, of course, but that was actually a huge question. "Getting off," I said, grabbing my bags and rushing along the aisle and down the steps before I bolted back to Peterborough. "Town Square's that way," he called after me, pointing along the road. Clearly I didn't look like someone who knew where they were going. "Will I be able to find a taxi there?" "Shouldn't be a problem," he said, before closing the doors and swinging the bus round to face the way we'd just come. I hoisted my pack onto my back and headed in the direction he had indicated. The little town looked lovely in the sunshine, almost idyllic. There was a busy market in the centre of the square and an interesting variety of shops around the edges. There was a pretty cafe set behind a cherry tree with some sort of gallery next door, and a pub with an impressive array of spring flowering containers. The friendly chatter and busyness reminded me of where I shopped in Italy, and I tried to marry my initial impression of the place with a vision of Mum. This must have been where she visited and hung out when she was growing up, but I couldn't picture her anywhere. Work hard, play hard was the ethos she had lived by. The second she'd earned enough in the country, she was off to the bright lights and big cities to spend it and immerse herself in new experiences. But there didn't look to be those sorts of opportunities here. Winbridge looked too restrained for her taste, altogether too small, but I was charmed. That said, the town was no doubt a very different place all those years ago, and Mum a different person. Perhaps it had satisfied her until she fell pregnant with me, and her life had inevitably changed. "Can you take me to Fenview Farm, please?" I asked the only cab driver who was parked in a bay marked out for taxis. "Do you have a postcode?" I couldn't place his accent. "Yes," I said, pulling a scrap of paper out of my jeans pocket and handing it over. "It's on Ladies' Drove, if that's any help." "Yes," he said, as I stuffed my bags into the back of the car. "I know that road. It's the fruit farm you want." The journey only took a few minutes, but in that time my heart started to canter again, and as we came to a stop and I took in more of the landmark orchards, I thought it was going to make a bid for freedom and burst right out of my chest. "This is it," said the driver. "That's £4, please." "Keep the change," I said, the words sticking in my throat as I handed him a £5 note. "Thanks. Do you need a receipt?" No, thank you." I took in the peeling farm sign, which was leaning drunkenly towards the road. This didn't look like the Fenview farm that I had spent the long watches of the previous night building up in my mind. I wondered if the rosy-cheeked Nonna and big-hearted Nonno I had imagined were going to be missing too. There was a small red car parked in the yard, so clearly someone was home. The taxi driver cleared his throat, making me jump. "Sorry," I said. "I'll get out." I still didn't move. "Do you need a hand?" "No," I said. "It's all right, I can manage." I had barely closed the door before he pulled away, leaving me in a cloud of dust. I watched until he was out of sight, then took a tentative step into the yard.
"Elliot," shouted a voice from the house. "Is that you? You've taken your time, haven't you?"
The voice didn't sound old enough to belong to my grandmother, and obviously I had no idea who Elliot was, so I felt on the back foot even before I'd knocked on the door.
"Come on," called the voice again. "Hurry up, I have to go."
I took a deep breath, walked briskly to the open door, and knocked loudly on the frame in the hope that whoever was inside would realise I wasn't who they were expecting.
"Stop buggering about and give me a hand, would you? I need to get to Mrs. Simpkins. Her stats were ridiculously low first thing, and I—"
The words trailed off as the owner of the voice glared up from the pile of paper she was rifling through and saw me hovering in the doorway.
"Oh," she frowned. "Not Elliot, then?"
"Afraid not." I smiled apologetically.
"And not the doctor either?"
"Definitely not the doctor." The young woman, dressed in a blue healthcare tunic, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, looked me up and down, and then dumped the papers back on the table. She couldn't have looked more annoyed if she tried.
"So who are you, then?" she frowned.
I cleared my throat. I really didn't want to tell her. She was obviously neither of my grandparents, and I had planned to announce myself to them before anyone else.
"Do you not know?"
she snapped. "Fliss," I swallowed. "Felicity Brown." I knew instantly that I should have just said my first name, but her waspish manner had thrown me, and I found myself in an even more heightened state of tension than I had been when I climbed out of the taxi.
"Brown?"
"Yes," I swallowed. There was no point retracting it now.
"You're a relative?"
she asked, sounding slightly less peeved. "Granddaughter," I told her, my voice barely louder than a whisper. There. I'd said it. The cat was definitely out of the bag.
"Granddaughter?"
she repeated. I wanted to ask her to lower her voice, but daren't. She still looked irritated, and I found her a bit intimidating, even though she was only a tiny little thing. "That's right," I confirmed. It was a less than satisfactory start, and I felt my shoulders sag. In my head, I'd imagined finding my grandparents sitting together, perhaps enjoying a mid-morning coffee and looking through the newspaper when I rocked up, presented myself, and made their day. Facing a harassed care worker before I'd even properly crossed the threshold hadn't been part of any of the fantasies I'd indulged in. I wondered which of my two grandparents required the assistance of the aggravated carer.
"Well, come in properly then,"
she said, looking me over again. I shuffled into the cool kitchen and rested my rucksack against the table while my gaze flicked around the room. It was practical, with a few homely touches, but not particularly tidy. I wasn't sure exactly what I had been expecting, but this place didn't match the comforting rustic Rossi space that I associated with country kitchens.
"You don't look much like a Brown,"
said the carer, narrowing her eyes.
"And Bill's never mentioned family to me, but then he is quite a private person, isn't he?"
Bill was my grandfather's name then. I wondered if it might be short for William. Mum really should have added her parents' names to her letter, but then, given the little energy she'd had when she wrote it, it was a miracle she'd got down as much as she had. I tentatively agreed, guessing that it was most likely him who was under the weather. "And I've not been around," I added. "I've been abroad." It wasn't quite a lie.
"Been travelling, have you?"
she asked, sounding envious. "I've been in Italy," I said, my cheeks colouring.
"Lucky you,"
she sniffed. thankfully distracted from my family connection. The furthest I've been in the last couple of years is the other side of Peterborough, and that was only for a weekend, and it chucked it down the whole time. I'm Vicky, by the way.
Nice to meet you, Vicky.
I shouldn't still be here, she then impatiently added, before checking her watch. I was only supposed to get his meal sorted, but he's not right, so I thought I'd better hang on. I called the doctor ages ago, and Elliot's supposed to be on his way too. I still had no idea who Elliot was, but didn't want to raise her suspicions by asking. The way she casually dropped his name into the conversation suggested that if I knew my grandfather, then I should know Elliot too.
What's wrong with him?
I asked, now completely certain it was my grandfather who was unwell.
Water infection, I reckon.
Thankfully, that didn't sound too serious. He's got a bit of a temperature and he can't stop peeing. He's confused too. He keeps asking for Felicity, your grandmother. Vicky shook her head and let out a long breath. The poor love. My head began to spin and I gripped the edge of the table. I had my grandmother's name. Mum had given me her mother's name. How could she never have mentioned that in the years since I'd been born?
I see,
I swallowed. I haven't got the heart to keep telling him she's been dead for the last 30+ years every time he starts shouting for her. It's nice that you're named after her, though. You all right? You've gone a bit pale. I clung tighter to the table, my knuckles turning white, and nodded.
Yes,
I said, my voice an octave too high.
I'm okay, just a bit tired after my journey.
But of course that wasn't it. I'd had no idea that my grandmother wasn't alive. I'd been expecting to find both her and my grandfather at the farm. My cosy Nonna and Nonno dream was evaporating before my eyes. What else had I mistakenly assumed?
Thankfully his scar is healing up nicely,
Vicky carried on, blissfully unaware of the blows she had just delivered.
So that's something, but he's going to be stiff when he starts the exercises again. But it can't be helped. He's certainly not steady enough on that new hip to carry on with them at the moment.
Right. A water infection and a new hip. Definitely not a quick fix. My timing really couldn't have been worse.
But thank goodness you're here now,
Vicky rushed on, smiling for the first time since I'd arrived.
You'll be able to manage until the doctor gets here, won't you?
Oh, no, I quickly shot back. I'm not staying, I can't. Vicky looked shocked, but not as shocked as I felt.
Well, I can't either, she said, fiddling with the papers again. I've got to get to Mrs. Simpkins. I told her I'd be there almost an hour ago.
But I don't know what to do to help him, I protested. I didn't add that I didn't know him either.
You won't have to do anything, said Vicky, who was already halfway out the door. The doctor will be here any second and she'll sort him out. Just go and sit with him. Tell him about your holiday in Italy. That'll distract him.
I didn't know about distracting him. I thought the shock of my unexpected arrival was more likely to finish him off completely.
Chapter 3.
I watched with a sinking heart as Vicky speedily completed a neat 3-point turn, pulled out of the yard, and drove off in the same direction as the taxi had gone, without a backwards glance. She hadn't even said goodbye to my grandfather, and now he was left in my care, and I had absolutely no idea what to do with him. With one ear still on the road, and desperately hoping to hear the cavalry, I turned back to the kitchen and took the room in more detail, all the while trying to assimilate the wealth of new information I had just been given. Looking beyond the piles of newspapers, dirty laundry in the basket, and unwashed dishes crowding the sink, I could see there were the foundations of what had once been a lovely room. Whether it was no longer fulfilling its potential because my grandfather couldn't manage to keep on top of it, or because he didn't care whether it looked lovely or not, I had no idea, but it wouldn't take much to get it back to its former glory. I ran my fingers along the edge of the battered pine table, which stood in the middle of the floor, and wondered if this was where Mum had sat and eaten when she was growing up. Had she been responsible for any of the dents and scuffs which marked the wood? Had she sat and lamented the loss of her mother here, like I had so recently mourned for her around the Rossi table?
Vicky!
My hand flew to my chest, and my heart thrummed. If that was how my grandfather usually sounded, then I could appreciate some of the reason why Mum had distanced herself from him. He sounded terrifying.
Vicky!
He belligerently bellowed again.
Where are you? I need you!
The gruff demand hadn't come from upstairs, but from somewhere on the ground floor. There was no longed-for timely arrival of a car on the drive, and I knew I was going to have to make my presence known, but what was I going to say? Bill Brown sounded extremely agitated, and the sudden appearance of a complete stranger, when he was already in such a vulnerable state, was hardly going to endear me to him or form an instant bond, was it?
Right, I'll do it myself,
he yelled. That sounded serious. What if he was trying to get off his chair or out of his bed and took a tumble? That wouldn't help him bed a recently replaced hip. I took another deep breath and quickly headed towards the room I could hear him calling from. There was no time to process my emotions as I laid eyes on my grandfather for the very first time, because he was, just as I had feared, trying to get himself out of the bed which had been shoehorned into what looked like the dining room. I dithered for a fraction of a second, then rushed forward to stop him toppling over.
About bloody time,
he muttered, leaning his full weight against me. He was heavier than I expected, and it took all of my strength to support him and stop my knees from buckling.
Who the hell are you?
He wheezed when he realised I wasn't Vicky.
What are you doing in my house?
It was exactly what I had feared. He was going to have a coronary, and it was all my fault. I'm Vicky's helper, I told him, in what I hoped was a placatory tone as I eased him carefully back onto the bed.
I don't want you,
he said, looking over my shoulder to the door.
I want Vicky.
I wanted Vicky too. She'll be back in a minute, I told him. And the doctor will be here too. I was feeling well out of my depth and more than a little afraid.
I don't want that quack, he shouted. There's nothing wrong with me.
I begged to differ, but was in no position to say as much. With him leant back against his pillows, I could see his face properly. His glasses were a little skew-if, and I automatically reached out to straighten them, but he batted my hand away and did it himself. His hair was white, and his face, hands and forearms were deeply tanned. It wasn't the sort of tan you got from a holiday, rather one that you developed as a result of a lifetime working outdoors. He looked older than his years, but then having recently undergone surgery and with a water infection brewing, that was little wonder.
Who are you?
He wheezily demanded. I'm Felicity, I said, my name escaping before I had the sense to check myself.
Who?
Felicity, I said again, though this time more quietly. His frown disappeared, and his eyes were filled with wonder, and then, to my horror, they were awash with tears.
I've been calling for you,
he said, his lip trembling. Oh God, now he thought I was his wife.
No,
he suddenly yelled, making me jump back. His expression transformed into one of pure fury as he realised I wasn't the Felicity he wanted.
You're not my wife. You're not my Felicity. What are you doing here? Get out!
I took another step away, my mouth opening and closing like a trapdoor, but no more words fell out. Which was probably just as well, because I'd already said too much. I should never have come here. As soon as the doctor arrived, I would head back to town and get the bus to Peterborough and then book a flight back to Puglia. This whole debacle was a disaster. I'd made a huge mistake, and so had Mum, in thinking that I'd fit in here. It was foolish of her and me to think it was necessary for me to come. A lot had happened in the time since she'd left, and neither of us had had the sense to realise that.
Get out!
He shouted again, making me flinch.
Now then, Bill, said a calm voice behind me. What's all the fuss? I can hear you out on the road.
I spun round.
She's not my wife, he said again. She's not my Felicity.
I'm Dr. Clark, said the woman who had slipped in unheard thanks to the furore. I'm here to see Mr. Brown.
Who are you?
She's not my wife,
my grandfather persisted, his words accompanied by an accusatory finger.
She's not my wife.
Would you mind waiting outside, please?
I couldn't get back to the kitchen and outside fast enough. My hands were shaking as I reached for my rucksack. I couldn't believe I'd made such a mess of everything. I hadn't been so naive as to think my turning up would go without a hitch, but I hadn't for a single second thought it would all go so spectacularly wrong either. Twice I'd stupidly blurted out my name and, in the process, ruined everything. Right on cue, Mum's letter, safe and snug with Nonna's recipe, rustled against the fabric of my shirt. Should I leave it? I wondered. My fingers hovered over the pocket for the briefest moment and then retracted. No, I'd keep it with me and disappear again without a trace. With any luck, my grandfather's delirium would stop him from remembering the ugly little scene that had just played out once he'd recovered. Assuming he did. And with even more luck, the doctor wouldn't mention me. Vicky would be too busy and stressed to remember our brief exchange, and it would be as if I'd never existed. Blast, I muttered, as I pulled out my phone and tried to ring for a taxi. Not a single bar of signal was filled. I hoisted my pack higher and stepped out of the door. Hopefully I wouldn't have to walk too far along the drove before I hit, if not a signal hotspot, then perhaps a lukewarm one. The distant drone of an engine met my ears as I reached the farm gate, and I swallowed down the lump in my throat which had grown even bigger because of it. It was a Ducati motorbike engine. There was no mistaking it. Alessandro had strictly forbidden his son from buying a motorbike, but that hadn't stopped Marco firing up YouTube and watching endless videos of the powerful machines going round and round the circuits at Mugello and Misano, or pointing out that, with his famous surname, a bike should have been his birthright. It used to drive both me and Nonna crackers, but in my heightened emotional state, it made me want to cry. In that moment, I would have given anything to swap the dusty drove road in front of me for the equally dusty track which led to the Rossi's farm. This had to be a sign. I needed to get back to my haven in Puglia as soon as possible. The bike was on me in a blink of an eye and turned smoothly into the farm gateway as I took a step out of the way. The person riding it was clearly a guy, tall and well-built, easily filling the leathers which matched the machine's classic red livery. I turned back to the road and tried to decide which way to go. "Wait up!" called the rider as he cut the engine. I had no intention of waiting up. I just wanted to get far away as quickly as possible. "Don't take another step!" he crossly shouted when I didn't stop. Was he for real? Who the hell did he think he was? "Are you talking to me?" I scowled, spinning back to face him and easily matching his aggression. If he was looking for a row, he'd certainly picked the right moment and the right person come to that. I could feel all of my grief and frustration welling up. It really wouldn't take much for my volcano of emotions to erupt on an epic scale. "I don't see anybody else here," he shot back. He unzipped the front of the all-in-one suit to reveal a broad chest encased in a plain dark t-shirt. His helmet and gloves were already balanced on the bike seat, and I had to resist the urge to march over and knock them off. I also had to resist the flutter in my chest, which occurred in response to the sudden and shocking spark of attraction which rushed through me as I took in his thick dark hair and handsome face. What a ridiculous and inconvenient moment for me to fancy someone. "What do you want?" I haughtily asked, struggling to extinguish the growing flame as he ran his hands through his hair and readjusted his glasses. The tough biker image, combined with the studious-looking frames and glowering mood, was a total contradiction, but a very sexy one. I could almost feel Mum's elbow nudging me in the ribs and see the mischievous smile which would have lit up her beautiful face had she been standing next to me. She always had an eye for a handsome man. I ignored what I knew would have been her reaction to this guy's arrival and instead focused on snuffing out the flame of desire. "What?" I shrugged. The biker and I stood staring at each other for what must have been just a couple of seconds, but felt far longer. I couldn't be sure, but he seemed to be as taken aback by the sight of me as I was by the look of him. "Who exactly are you?" he frowned. "Who are you?" I quickly countered. I asked first. I shrugged and turned away again. "I'm Elliot," he said to my back. "I'm a friend of Mr. Brown's and currently one of his home carers."
He couldn't have looked any less like what I assumed a home carer would look like if he tried. Not that I generally went in for stereotypes, but this guy was becoming more unfathomable by the second. "Then it's a shame you weren't here earlier, when Vicky needed you, wasn't it?" I snapped. "She said you were really late and she had to leave, but the doctor's here now."
"I couldn't be here earlier," he told me, "because one of the people I look after had a hypo and I had to stay with them until the ambulance arrived."
Oh. I supposed that sounded like an adequate excuse for his late arrival. It certainly took some of the gale force wind out of my inflated sails.
"But never mind that," he continued. "You still haven't told me who you are."
"I'm no one," I shrugged, turning away again and looking towards the road. I was determined not to give up my identity to another stranger. "I was just passing and I heard someone shouting as I reached the gate, so I stopped to check everything was okay." I knew that sounded unlikely, but I really didn't want this guy knowing my name. If he was as good a friend to my grandfather as he made out, then he would no doubt mention that he had bumped into someone claiming the family name, and that was the last thing I wanted. I needed to get out of Windbridge without another soul sussing me out.
"But my colleague was here then, was she?"
"I've already told you she was."
"And she left you with Mr. Brown and headed off?"
Elliot frowned as I risked another look at him.
"She just left you, a total stranger, in charge here and carried on with her day?"
"That's right." And it was right, I was a total stranger. Bill Brown and I might have shared blood, but we didn't know each other. "Just like you, she had an emergency to get to," I added for good measure. "And I need to head off now as well, so if you don't mind."
"I do mind, actually," he shot back, "because the way Vicky tells it, you told her that you were Mr. Brown's granddaughter called Felicity, and that's why she left you with him."
Bugger. Of course, she'd told him that. How could she not? She would have had to offer some justification for abandoning her post, and the presence of a family member would have been a more than adequate one, wouldn't it? "Did she?" I asked, chewing my lip.
"She did."
"Well, that's as may be," I said, aiming for distraction. "But don't you think you ought to be going inside? The doctor might need some help."
"I'm not going anywhere unless you come with me,"
he said, pulling his arms completely out of the leather suit and pushing it down to his slim waist.
"I don't want to let you out of my sight."
I wasn't sure how to read his tone, but I knew I had no choice other than to begrudgingly follow him back inside. The doctor entered the kitchen from the opposite direction just as we walked in and closed the door behind her. "Ah, Elliot," she smiled, "you're a sight for sore eyes."
"I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner," he apologised. "I've just seen Joe off to hospital. The ambulance took an age to arrive, otherwise I would have been here a good hour ago."
I rather wished he had been here then. I might not have been intimidated by Vicky and ended up revealing my true identity as a result. I could have scarpered without any of the intervening fiasco. "What's the matter with them all?" Dr. Clark tutted. "They're dropping like flies today." She eyed me curiously. "You didn't get the chance to introduce yourself before," she pointed out. "Oh, I'm no one," I told her. "I just happened to be passing earlier, heard shouting and put my head in to see if everything was okay." I could feel Elliot's eyes fixed on me. "Mr. Brown was very upset when I arrived." The doctor frowned. "I don't suppose he was expecting to find a stranger in his house." I smiled weakly. "But I was only trying to help. He got more upset when I told him my name." "Ah," she said as the pager in her hand began to bleep. "Yes, Felicity. That'll account for some of his confusion then. That was his wife's name. She's been dead for quite some time." "Right," I said, horribly aware that Elliot was still staring. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Not to worry," she said, thankfully distracted by the pager. "You weren't to know. I've got his meds sorted now, and he'll be right as rain in no time, although Vicky shouldn't have left him here alone." "He wasn't alone," I cut in, not wanting her to get in trouble. She might track me down and subject me to further intimidation. "I was here, and I said I'd wait because she was in a rush to get to someone else who was poorly." "I'll still have to talk to her," said Dr. Clark. "It isn't usual practice to leave a patient with a stranger under any circumstances."
"Do I need to pick anything up for Bill today?"
Elliot asked.
thankfully not revealing to the doctor who Vicky had told him I was. No, I had everything I needed for today with me.
That's good, said Elliot.
I thought his eyes were still tracking back to me, but I didn't dare check. Right, I have to go, said Dr. Clark, waving the pager about. Apparently I'm needed back in town. Thank heavens this thing still works out here in the land of no mobile signal. You might need to pick up more meds for Bill next week, Elliot.
That's fine, he said, moving aside. I'll see you out.
Nice to meet you, Felicity, she smiled. Why don't you get the kettle on before you go? I'm sure everyone would feel better after a nice cup of tea.
I'll do it in a minute, said Elliot. And I'm going to stay here for the next couple of days too, just to be on the safe side.
That had to be service above and beyond the usual remit of home carer. Elliot had said that he was a friend of my grandfather's, and that kind gesture proved it. That would be a great help if it isn't too much trouble, said Dr. Clark. I had been wondering if it would be better to take him back into hospital.
Oh, no, said Elliot, don't do that. You know how frustrated he was when they wouldn't let him home straight after surgery. I'm happy to be here, and Vicky's already redrafted the rota because I'm supposed to be on holiday.
Elliot, the doctor sighed. Where would we be without you? He ducked his head, but didn't answer, and I began to feel guilty for biting his head off when he turned up. I supposed my unexpected arrival and claim to the Brown name did in some way justify him ordering me back into the house, and now I hadn't fessed up to the doctor about who I was, his continued suspicious stare was nothing more than I deserved. I'll put the kettle on, I offered, trying to make amends. Given the circumstances, it was the least I could do. Excellent, nodded Dr. Clark before rushing out. By the time Elliot had seen her off, pulled off his boots and leather suit, and checked on my grandfather, who had fallen asleep, I had made a pot of tea and rinsed out a mug.
Who isn't having any?
He frowned. Me, I told him. I think it would be best if I left, don't you?
But you've only just arrived.
I know, I said, but my timing's not ideal, is it? I'll go. Elliot looked at me again. This time his head was cocked as if he was trying to weigh me up. He was probably wondering if I was the real deal or a possible imposter.
Look,
he said, as I fiddled with the straps on my rucksack.
I know you probably think I was out of order for snapping at you before.
No, I don't, I quickly interrupted, though just a few minutes ago I'd been fizzing. You're just looking out for my grandfather, I get that. And someone turning up out of the blue and claiming to be a relative isn't a usual Saturday morning occurrence, is it?
No, it isn't,
he said, clearly relieved that I'd accepted his previously harsh tone.
And you don't look like a Brown. Not that I'm suggesting you're not who you say you are, but as far as I know, neither dark hair nor olive skin feature in the family tree.
Definitely weighing up my credentials, then. My dad was Italian, I told him, giving up yet more information.
Oh, right.
I never knew him, but Mum left here to look for him when she found out she was pregnant with me. She didn't find him, though. I didn't seem able to stop myself from blurting stuff out. It was definitely time to head back to town.
And she's never come back here in all that time, has she?
Elliot mused. No.
You know, he pondered, I don't even think Bill knows she had a baby. He certainly never mentioned a grandchild to me.
That made me feel marginally better. At least my grandfather wasn't hankering for something he'd never had, even if, thanks to Mum's letter, I had started to.
How old are you?
Elliot asked. 28.
I'm 26, so only slightly younger.
Does he ever talk about her? I couldn't resist asking.
He used to, but not for years now. Not to me, anyway. That said, he hasn't talked about much at all recently. He's not had the best couple of years.
Oh.
He's not been well, and not being able to properly look after the farm has only added to his problems. We're all hoping he's turned a corner now he's got this new hip. Hopefully he'll be up and running and back to his old self again soon. God knows the farm needs him.
Elliot was giving up information as readily as I was, and knowing my grandfather's life was on the up again did go some way to making me feel better about not hanging around. I knew Mum had wanted me to come and potentially stay, but her dad didn't need this sort of revelation at this point in his recuperation. Come to that, he probably never would.
Finding out about you is going to come as a bit of a shock, though,
Elliot then said. Well, I said, I didn't tell him anything other than my name, and that could just be a coincidence like the doctor assumed, so if you and Vicky can keep it to yourselves, he won't find out, will he? I'll be out of sight in a minute, and no one will be any the wiser.
Is that why you didn't tell Dr. Clark who you are?
Yes, I nodded. I'd already made up my mind to go again, and so the fewer people who know about me, the better. And no one at all needed to know what had happened to Mum. No matter how she had left things here when she ran away, her premature demise would be the biggest shock of all. That was one thing I could stop myself revealing. Parents weren't supposed to outlive their children. It wasn't the natural order of things.
But you'll come back at some point, won't you? Elliot asked. Give it a few months and then come again?
I shook my head. No, I said, I won't do that. I shouldn't have come at all.
I'm not sure I can agree with you about that.
Elliot frowned. Well, I said, pulling on my pack, I'm not asking you to agree with me. Just forget you ever saw me. He scanned my face again, and his flushed.
I don't think I'll be able to do that either.
He smiled. His face was completely transformed, the lines around his eyes crinkled in such a way that suggested he spent more time laughing than frowning, and I found I was rather pleased about that. I broke eye contact first and looked away, wondering if his libido had taken a hit like mine had.
Does your mum know you're here?
He asked, clearing his throat. I shook my head.
What made you come now?
He carried on, determined to get more out of me before I left.
No offence, but you've taken your time.
I kept my lips tightly pressed together.
Are you sure you're going to be okay?
I'll be fine, I said, dashing for the door. It was nice to meet you, Elliot. Thank you for looking after my grandfather. Once I was back on the road, I sent up a silent apology to Mum. I was certain that she had written her letter with the best of intentions, with a view to making amends for all the years of holding back, but it was too late to try and squeeze myself into a shape that would fit Fenview Farm. Life there had moved on. Her dad had the chance for the fresh start he obviously needed, and there was no way I was going to risk screwing it up for him. I was going to catch a plane back to Italy, and my roots were staying put in Puglia.
End of CD 1. CD 2.
Chapter 4. I had only walked about half a mile when I heard a car on the road behind me. My ears had been straining to hear the throaty rumble of the Ducati, but it hadn't come. For some strange reason, part of me had wanted Elliot to come after me, even though I knew my grandfather was in no fit state to be left alone. I also knew that even though nothing could come of it, I had felt an almost magnetic pull towards Elliot, and the look he'd given me before I left made me think he'd felt it too. I didn't usually hanker for romantic gestures or grand at-first-sight moments, but truth be told, I wouldn't have minded Elliot roaring up and sweeping me off my feet. It was pure fantasy, of course, because given his closeness to my grandfather, any sort of contact between us would have made keeping me a secret impossible, and besides, I was grieving, and my life was in turmoil. A whirlwind romance should have been the last thing on my mind, shouldn't it? That said, I could have easily succumbed to a bit of nurturing, although I wasn't entirely sure that's where my thoughts about Elliot had been heading. Feeling wrung out after the emotion of the morning and throwing caution to the wind, I stuck out my thumb. Hitchhiking was hardly the safest option, but thanks to the last dregs of adrenaline still coursing through my system, I knew I had just about enough physical strength in me to fight off even the most persistent assailant, should I need to. Even so, it was still a heart-stopping moment when the car drove past and then bumped up onto the verge, effectively blocking my path. The driver, a woman, leant across the seats and opened the passenger door.
"Hey," she shouted, "are you Felicity Brown?"
So much for staying incognito. I wondered if it was Vicky or Elliot who had gone blabbing.
I hoped it was Vicky. I'd felt pretty certain Elliot would manage to keep me to himself, even if he hadn't been able to commit to forgetting he'd seen me. "Can you give me a lift into Winbridge?" I asked, ignoring the question and peering into the car to find a woman with wild, curly, greying hair and a tentative smile. She looked to be about Mum's age.
"Later, perhaps," she said, her smile slipping a little as her eyes met mine. "But for now, I'd like you to come back to the farm with me."
"What? The farm back along the drove?" I asked, feigning ignorance.
"Yes."
"Why on earth would I want to do that?"
"Because you are Felicity Brown, aren't you?"
She was like a dog with a bone, and I didn't know how to shake her off. If I carried on walking, she'd doubtless follow me all the way to Winbridge. "Yes," I sighed. "I am, but I'm not going back to the farm."
"Please," she pleaded.
"Who even are you?" I asked, letting my rucksack slip off my shoulders. I was sure it felt heavier than when I'd left Italy.
"I'm Elliot's mum."
I hung my head and let out a long breath.
"He just rang to ask me to take some stuff to the farm and mentioned that you'd turned up."
I nodded.
"He went nuts when I said I was going to come and find you."
That was probably because mentioning me had just slipped out, and given the bout of blabbermouth I'd experienced at the farm, I could hardly hold it against him. "And why would my turning up be of such interest to you?" I asked.
"Because I'm an old friend of your mum's," the woman explained, her voice catching. "My name's Louise Randall. Your mum wrote to me a couple of months ago and told me all about you. I hadn't heard from her in almost 30 years. She said you might turn up."
She knew then. She knew what had happened to Mum. "Right," I said, swallowing down the lump which had lodged itself in my throat again. "I see." In Italy, no one had mentioned another letter, but someone must have sent it on Mum's behalf. I didn't think it could have been Alessandro, Marco, or Nonna, because they would have said about it when I read them mine. Perhaps Mum had coerced one of the nurses who came to visit into helping, or the doctor, perhaps. I wondered if any more revelatory letters were waiting to be revealed.
"Come on," Louise encouraged. "Come back to the farm and we'll have a proper chat."
"But what about my grandfather?"
"Don't worry," she said, unable to keep the wobble out of her voice. "William doesn't know anything. Not about you or your mum."
"And I want to keep it that way," I said, sounding fiercer than I perhaps intended to.
"That's your call," she nodded. "I just want to talk to you for a few minutes."
"And then you'll drive me to Winbridge?"
"If that's what you want."
"It is."
"All right, then. We'll have some lunch and a chat, and then I'll take you to town."
Back at the farm, Elliot had set out more mugs, refreshed the pot, and made a plateful of chunky cheese and ham sandwiches.
"I'm so sorry,"
he said to me while glaring at his mum the second we walked back into the kitchen.
"It just sort of
slipped out?"
"Yeah,"
he said, running a hand through his already mussed-up hair. "It's okay," I shrugged. "No harm done, I suppose."
"What with that and pointing out that you don't look like a Brown," he said,
evidently still feeling bad,
"you must have a pretty low opinion of me right now."
"What on earth made you say that?"
Louise tutted at him. Elliot and I looked at each other and exchanged a smile. Surely it was more than obvious. "I think it was something to do with the fact that I look more Italian than East Anglian," I told Louise, pulling my thick dark ponytail over my shoulder.
"But your father was Italian,"
she said, then clapped her hand over her mouth. This inability to keep quiet was catching. Everyone seemed to have a dose.
"You knew Jennifer was pregnant when she ran off?"
Elliot glowered. Louise pulled out a chair and sat down heavily on it.
"Yes," she said,
as her face and neck flushed scarlet.
"Yes, I did."
"Why didn't you tell Bill?"
"And further add to his misery?" Louise shot back without hesitation. "Not likely."
I joined her at the table, wondering what else she knew that my grandfather and I didn't. Was this letter you received from Mum a few weeks ago a one-off? I asked her, or had she been in touch before?
And she wrote to you?
Elliot flared again. Keep your voice down, Louise said, jerking her head towards the door which led to the room where my grandfather was sleeping. Elliot rushed to close it. Apart from the brief note she left when she ran away, it was a one-off, she then said to me, and it was a shock to get it, I can tell you. Given what it no doubt said, I'm sure it was. I can imagine, I breathed, feeling another rush of grief. Elliot stopped in his tracks, but this time didn't say anything. She told me she had cancer, and that she hadn't long to live, Louise softly said. She also said that she'd left you a letter about this place, that she felt ashamed for not telling you about it before, and that you might make up your mind to come here when you read it after. She pulled a tissue out from her sleeve and wiped her eyes. So your being here, she asked between sobs, means she's gone, doesn't it? Yes, I said, as tears slid down my face. She's gone. Elliot passed me a box of tissues from the dresser.
I'm so sorry, he said. I didn't realise.
I didn't tell you, I told him, because I didn't want to burden you with knowing about that as well as me and not being able to say anything.
You don't have to explain,
he kindly said. And I didn't tell you about the letter for the same reason, Louise told her son. You're so close to Bill, it wouldn't have been fair. I thought it best to bide my time and see if Felicity turned up and then decide what to do.
And here she is.
Elliot smiled down at me.
I wish it was under different circumstances, but I'm glad you came.
I'm not sure I am, I sniffed. I don't know what to do now. We all sat together, and over the tea and sandwiches, I told them about the colourful and often nomadic life Mum had lived, about the travelling and the adventures, and how even though she'd been let down by my father, she'd found a refuge at the Rossis and established a base with them in Puglia. We did come to the UK sometimes, I explained, but never near here.
You travelled with her?
Elliot asked. Not so much recently, but when I was growing up, she took me everywhere with her then.
Elliot was agog. She sounds amazing,
he dreamily said. She had her moments. I smiled, this time through happier tears. But she never mentioned the farm or her father, Louise wanted to know, or the fact that she'd named you after her very own mother. Never. She might have been amazing, but that sounds like her too, Louise sniffed. I don't mean to speak ill, but even as a young woman she had a tendency to live her life exactly how she wanted to. I couldn't deny that she was right about that, but given that it had been a life cut so short, I felt happy that Mum had pleased herself when it came to living it. Although not that she had left her father to endure a lifetime of worry about what had happened to her when she took off, of course.
And you never thought to ask about what her life was like before you were born?
Elliot asked. No, I flushed. I didn't. I know that was stupid now, but I never had any reason to give it a thought. It wasn't stupid, said Louise, reaching for my hand. You no doubt trusted her, even though you weren't consciously aware of it. Deep down, you probably thought that if there was anything worth knowing, then she would have told you about it. Perhaps. You must have been very happy living with this family to think of them as your own, she added. I was, I said. I am. And besides, we all have our secrets, don't we?
Some more than others,
Elliot remarked. He was obviously still smarting over the fact that his mum had known my mum was pregnant when she disappeared and never said anything, but I could completely understand Louise's reasoning for keeping it to herself. My grandfather certainly wouldn't have felt any better knowing he had lost his daughter and a grandchild. And what about your father? She asked me, picking up on what Elliot was getting at. Did she tell you anything about him? Only that he was a holiday fling and very good-looking. Oh, he was. Louise nodded. You knew him? I gasped. Not knew, Exactly, she said, allowing herself a wistful smile at the memory. We weren't with him long enough for that, but I did see him. Your mum and I were holidaying together. It was our first trip abroad. Your grandfather didn't want us to go on our own, but I convinced him it would be all right. I was always the sensible one, and I promised him I'd keep Jennifer out of mischief.
You didn't do a very good job, said Elliot, looking pointedly at me.
Thanks. I swallowed. Elliot!
Louise quickly stepped in. Sorry, he said, shaking his head. That didn't sound how I meant it to.
And you'll never know the depth of the guilt I've carried for all these years for not keeping a closer eye on her, Louise then said, making me feel 100 times worse.
Oh, and thank you too, I said, pushing back my chair.
Oh, love, she said, I don't mean...
No matter, I said, cutting her off and walking to the back door. I'm just going to get some fresh air. There wasn't much of a garden attached to the side of the house, but I found some shade from the spring sunshine under an ancient apple tree which was in the middle of an overgrown lawn around the side furthest from the yard. I sat down and looked back at the house and outbuildings, determined to phase the conversation out for a few minutes and take my surroundings in. I knew Elliot and Louise hadn't meant any harm, but I was feeling tired and emotional, and it had been easy for me to take offence at their poor choice of words. Best to have some time out before I said something I'd regret, especially as I was relying on Louise to run me back to town. I rested my back against the tree and looked about me. From what I could see of Fenview Farm, it was all a little rough around the edges, but homely enough, and there was no doubt in my mind that I would have found the day so much harder to cope with had it not been happening on a farm. The setting was comfortingly familiar, even if the events and revelations that were unfolding were completely alien.
I'm sorry about our inability to turn a phrase, said Louise, when she came out to join me a few minutes later. This has all been such a shock.
For all of us, I pointed out.
Yes, she said, sitting on the grass next to me. For all of us, and I don't want you to misconstrue or take anything that Elliot might foolishly say to heart. It's really not personal or aimed at upsetting you. He's just very protective of Bill.
I can see that, I conceded. My grandfather is very lucky to have Elliot in his corner.
Their relationship works both ways, Felicity. She smiled.
What does that mean? I asked. And it's Fliss. No offence, but everyone calls me Fliss, not Felicity.
Fliss, then. She nodded.
What do you mean about things working both ways? I prompted. As one, we looked towards the house, where Elliot had just come out with a basket of laundry, which he then started to peg out on the old-fashioned washing line.
He's very fond of your grandfather,
Louise quietly said, still watching her son. That much is more than obvious. I smiled.
You'd have to be an idiot not to realise it.
Not everyone would give up their holiday to look after a grumpy old man.
He's not really a grumpy old man.
Louise smiled back.
From what Elliot told me, the doctor said, you just caught him at the wrong moment.
That's good to know, I said. I'd hate to think that bad-tempered was his go-to.
It's really not, she carried on. He was a saviour to my son when he was a teenager.
How so? I asked, turning from staring at Elliot to look at her. She took a deep breath and a moment to compose herself.
As you've no doubt worked out, I had Elliot quite soon after your mum had you. I had fallen in love and married a local lad, but he tragically died young, and Elliot went off the rails quite badly until Bill took him under his wing. Your grandfather helped him find a purpose again. He kept him busy here on the farm, out of the bad company he'd fallen into, and consequently out of further mischief.
The way Louise spoke so fondly about my grandfather and the protective feelings Elliot obviously had for him made me wonder what had been the problem between him and Mum. From what I'd just heard, he didn't sound like a man who was difficult to get along with. What had happened between my two relatives that caused a rift that lasted, in Mum's case, a lifetime? Then I remembered some of the fallings out Mum and I had gone through when I hit my teens. I supposed other people's family were quite often easier to get on with than your own, weren't they?
I'm so sorry, I said to Louise. About your husband, I mean. It must have been so hard for her, struggling with her loss and an angry teenager. Thank you. It was a difficult time, but we eventually moved on. That's good. It is, she agreed, then sagely added, but you can't rush grief. You have to let it run its own course if you're going to deal with it properly, and you must accept that it never leaves you. It becomes a part of you, and you learn to live with it. I didn't much like the thought of carrying the way I was feeling now around with me forever. It will get easier, Louise then added, gently resting a hand on my shoulder. In time it won't be as all-consuming as it is now. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak for fear of crying again. I'd naively thought I was all cried out after Mum's funeral, but the well was still far from dry. A day hadn't yet passed when I hadn't succumbed to tears at some point. So much for assuming that coming here would take some of the edge off how much I missed her. We let the silence settle around us for a while, but I eventually broke it. I needed to move the day on. Thank you for fetching me back, I said. I'm pleased we've had this chance to talk. So am I. She smiled. I can't tell you how lovely it is to meet you. I wish it had happened 28 years ago, but there we are. At least it's happened now, I said, standing up and brushing the grass off my legs. Exactly, she agreed. I asked Elliot not to say anything about me to my grandfather, and I still stand by that, Louise. She looked aghast, but I pressed on. Like Elliot pointed out, this new hip marks a return to health for him, and he doesn't need to have his fresh start hindered by my arrival and news of what's happened to Mum. He's lived without her for almost 30 years, and given the circumstances, I think it would be best if he continued to do so. Louise shook her head, and I walked back over to the house before she launched her counter-argument. I knew she was going to try and make me change my mind, and given the emotional low ebb I was at, I had a feeling I might just relent, and that wouldn't be any help to my grandfather's new beginning at all. It was nice to meet you, Elliot, I said, picking up my rucksack again.
You're not leaving?
He asked, looking up from the magazine he was reading. As soon as your mum starts her car.
But you can't.
I must, I said over him.
Are you sure, Fliss? Is that really what you want?
It doesn't matter what Felicity wants, said Louise, who had followed me inside. There's only one person whose opinion really matters in all of this, and that's Bill's. But his fresh start, I reminded her. We agreed nothing should jeopardize that, didn't we? Elliot? I said, turning and appealing directly to him. He looked at his mum and puffed out his cheeks. I knew in an instant that he'd swapped sides, the traitor. Finding out that Mum's gone will be the worst news he ever hears, I told the two of them, and he didn't even know Mum was pregnant, so I'm no loss to him at all. Mother and son looked at each other and then at me. You're both mad, I told them. This is wrong.
More wrong than the two of us knowing about Jennifer and you and keeping it from him?
Elliot questioned.
I don't think I could live with myself,
said Louise, shaking her head.
Especially now I've met you, my love.
This was all wrong. We were supposed to just be having a chat, and then I was going to leave. Earlier on the road, that was what we'd agreed. I should never have come, I muttered again, more to myself than them, and now I'm thinking I shouldn't have let you bring me back. Yes, said Louise, her tone full of certainty and a determination I knew I couldn't beat. You should. Your mum wanted you to come here for a reason, Felicity, and I think you should stay. I wanted to remind her that I was Fliss, not Felicity, but for the moment had more pressing concerns.
So do I now, said Elliot, backing her up. I know I let you go before, but that was a mistake.
Louise looked delighted, but then she was winning. Don't overthink it, she said, reaching for my hand, and don't think too far ahead. Just take one step at a time. Her choice of words pulled me up short. That was exactly what I'd told the Rossis I was going to do. For now, Louise carried on when I didn't protest, let's just say you're staying until Bill's recovered from his infection. Elliot nodded in agreement. Give him a day or so to get back to his old self, and in that time you can think about whether you want to talk to him or not. But he's already seen me, I reminded her, and I've told him my name. It's already a total mess. Nothing we can't fix, she briskly said, her tone victorious. Right, Elliot?
Right, he said, backing her up. We'll work something out. It'll all come good in the end.
I wasn't sure it would, but looking between the two of them, I had no choice but to accept that the next few steps I took would be walked in the fens. Chapter 5. When Louise had reassured me that she and Elliot would find a way to sort out the muddle surrounding my arrival, I had assumed that she meant by offering me a bed at their place, with a trip or two back to the farm when my grandfather was recovered from his infection. However, it turned out that wasn't any part of her plan.
Oh, Mum,
Elliot protested when she explained what she did have in mind.
That's a ludicrous idea.
No, it's not, she responded, every bit as determinedly as her son. This is the Brown family home, and I think it's important that Felicity stays here. It's the ideal opportunity for her to get to know the house and the farm where her mother grew up. There was no way I was going to agree to that. That's impossible, I told her. I'll book into somewhere in town. I'm not risking bumping into my grandfather before he's completely recovered again. I couldn't bear another awkward encounter. I've already lied about who I am once. I'm certainly not going to put myself in a position where I have to do it again. Elliot nodded his approval, but Louise waved my concerns away. Bill's so out of it, he won't remember that, she airily said. Well, that's good then, I readily agreed, and while we're waiting for his meds to kick in, I'll bide my time in town and come back again when Elliot says he's all better. That way, it'll be like starting from scratch. We can pretend that my arrival at the farm then is my first. There was so much of this ill-fated day that I already wanted to forget, and I hoped that some time on neutral territory would help me do that. The town had looked warm and welcoming, so I'd take on the role of tourist and hang out in the pretty cafe and shops and explore the market. Winbridge had reminded me of the town I knew in Puglia the second I stepped off the bus, so the familiarity would be bound to settle my nerves and make me feel more at home. I wouldn't need to tell anyone who I was. I could take a leaf out of my mum's book and play the part of the mysterious traveller. Only she genuinely had been that person.
Sounds good to me,
said Elliot, coming to stand next to me in a show of solidarity and treating me to a waft of his wonderful aftershave. I flashed him a grateful smile. For taking my side, not for his heady scent. I didn't want him getting wind that I appreciated that. Unfortunately, Louise was far from convinced of the merits of my plan. Can I have a word, please, Elliot? She said to her son. Excuse us for a minute, will you, love? She led Elliot outside, and even though I couldn't hear what was being said, their body language suggested, if not an argument, then a heated discussion was taking place. It didn't look as flamboyant as the arm-raising Marco and Alessandro sometimes went in for, or sound as dramatic as their rapid-fire Italian, but it wasn't far off. I dodged out of sight of the door when they turned to come back in, hoping Louise hadn't somehow got her son on her side again, but he'd already come around to her way of thinking once.
I've changed my mind,
Elliot sheepishly said, rubbing a hand around the back of his neck. The gesture told me immediately that he'd been coerced and cajoled.
I think you should stay here. Get to know the place, like Mum said. Settle in a bit while Bill gets better.
His face was bright red by this point, and I wondered what Louise had said to make him change his mind. There was very little conviction behind his words. He clearly wasn't convinced his mother's idea was the right one, and neither was I. If you're all the way back in town, it'll be awkward fetching you in and out, said Louise, adding weight to Elliot's poor performance. But I could tell that wasn't anything to do with her real desire to keep me on sight. I didn't know what her real desire was, but it wasn't the inconvenience of having to drive me about. "I'll be working," she further said, "and Elliot only has the bike, so it won't be easy for either of us." "Well, that's no problem. I can use the taxi," I shrugged. "That was how I got here, and it was cheap enough. I wouldn't want to put you out, although I wouldn't mind riding pillion if push came to shove." Marco would be green with envy, and Elliot looked momentarily thrilled, but then caught sight of Louise's arched eyebrows.
"I won't be able to leave Bill,"
he muttered, avoiding my eye. Credit where it was due, Louise had done an extremely good job convincing him to agree with her mad plan. "But where will I sleep?" I said, clutching at the very last straw I could think of. "I'm not taking my grandparents' bed, and I certainly wouldn't sleep in Mum's old room."
"There's a spare,"
Elliot huskily said. "But you'll want that."
"No, I won't," he said, his tone apologetic. "I'm going to sleep in the room with Bill. I can't risk being anywhere else in case he decides to go for a wander and falls. Dr. Clark will zip him straight back into hospital if there's even the slightest hiccup, and I'm not going to be the one responsible for putting him or the nursing staff through that trauma again."
"That's settled then," said Louise, bringing the conversation to a close that satisfied her but no one else. "You're staying here. Elliot can go on the floor in the room where Bill is, and you'll be in the spare room. Oh, and here's Rebecca," she added, looking to the door as a car pulled into the yard.
"Who's Rebecca?" I asked Elliot as she rushed outside.
"My little sister."
Not another one. I didn't think I could cope with more of the Randall clan, and the sigh which spontaneously escaped my lips let him know it.
"Don't worry,"
Elliot smiled, picking up on my reluctance to become acquainted with more of his relatives.
"You'll like her. She's fun."
Thankfully, he was right. Rebecca was a sparky young woman, with her mother's head full of curls, only hers were dark blonde and long rather than greying, and she was dressed in bright, floaty clothes. She was only a year younger than Elliot, but she had a kind of youthful exuberance, whereas her brother and I perhaps came across as a bit more world-weary. He was right about her being fun. The atmosphere in the kitchen had become rather oppressive, but it lifted and lit up the moment she walked in. "I'm really sorry about your mum," she sincerely said, after Louise had introduced us and explained who I was, but how, for now, my identity had to be kept a secret. "But how amazing is it that you found your way here?" I wasn't sure it was amazing yet, but her bright smile certainly made me feel a bit better about life.
"You mustn't say anything to anyone," Elliot sternly told her. "That's really important."
"I won't," she pouted, before turning her sparkling eyes back to me. "And you must call me Beck, not Rebecca." "And I'm Fliss," I smiled back, not Felicity. Louise had introduced us using our full first names, but we obviously both preferred the abbreviated versions. "Fliss," Beck grinned, side-eyeing her mother. "Cool." "I don't understand you girls," Louise tutted. "You've both got beautiful names, and yet you refuse to use them." Beck ignored this, and I got the distinct impression that it was a comment she'd heard many times before. "I'm going to head into town for supplies for Elliot," she told me. "Is there anything I can pick up for you, or would you rather come with me?" "I'll come with you," I hastily said. "I could do with a couple of things now I know I'm going to be staying for a day or two." I didn't really need anything, but I wasn't going to pass up the opportunity to get away from the farm and Louise's well-meant bossiness for a little while. The last few hours had been intense, and some time out would give me the chance to draw breath, think things through, and get my head around everything. "I'll just grab my purse and phone," I said, rifling through my rucksack. There was no chance to think anything through en route, however, because Beck talked all the way into town, and by the time she parked her battered bright yellow 2CV next to the market, which was packing up for the day, she had given me a potted history of her entire life. Even though my head was spinning, her monologue had been an entertaining distraction, and I was surprised to find myself feeling calmer. She was an artist, recently graduated from Norwich University of the Arts, and in the process of setting up her own studio at home. She was currently specialising in abstract paintings. Huge canvases full of colour were what she loved most, and given her outfit and sunny disposition, they sounded very Beck to me. She was happily single, straight, and hoping to travel the world, when she could afford to further fuel her inspiration. She was as free-flowing as the river running under the bridge we'd driven over, and she really reminded me of Mum. Beck hadn't shied away from talking about what I was going through, and readily told me what she'd felt and experienced when her dad died. And not that I was looking to form any hasty attachments to the place, but I loved her already. "You can tell me about yourself on the drive back," she grinned when she realised she hadn't given me the chance to say a word. "There's nothing much to tell," I shrugged. "Rubbish," she said, locking her car. "I don't believe that for a second. Mum said you grew up in Italy. How can you have nothing to say about yourself with a start in life like that?" I laughed and shook my head. Beck was obviously a glass-half-full kind of girl. But she was right. I had had an unusual start in life, what with growing up with the Rossis and joining Mum on many of her adventures before I decided to settle, and now, of course, it was about to become even more intriguing. The plan for the trip to town was for us to stock the farm fridge, take books back to the library, and pick up a takeaway for dinner. But it was still a bit early for the takeaway part. "How about I cook instead?" I offered, when I spotted a smart-looking deli at the opposite end of the square. Elliot had told Beck not to be too long, and if we didn't have to wait for the takeaways to open, then we'd be back all the sooner, and to be honest, I didn't much fancy fish and chips or a kebab. I was craving a taste of home, but not Nonna's tart. I was going to save that for a special occasion. Unbidden, my hand checked that the recipe and Mum's letter were safe where they should be. "Could you?" Beck asked, wide-eyed. "Could you cook?" "Yes," I said, "if you think it will be okay, and as long as everyone likes Italian food." "What, like proper Italian, rather than greasy takeaway pizza?" "Yes," I said, eyeing the stalls on the market. "Yeah?" She nodded. "Okay, great." Beck left me to source the ingredients for dinner while she went to sort everything else. I soon found that the market was local foodie heaven, and as there was a fabulous fish stall, I decided to make a creamy lemon and shrimp risotto and an accompanying seafood salad. Everyone was very friendly, and I ended up buying far more than I needed, but I knew that a taste of Puglia and a few sessions at the stove would help me zen out and stop me stressing about staying at the farm. I thanked my lucky stars that Elliot was going to be there too, although I didn't like to think how I'd react if I bumped into him half-dressed in the middle of the night, especially if he was still wearing that wonderfully woody aftershave. Or was it just Oda Elliot that had set my pulse racing? I was weighed down even before I reached the deli to pick up the risotto rice and cheese and components for antipasto, but there was such a great array of ingredients on offer, including freshly made grissini and locally cured meats, that I couldn't resist piling my basket high in there too. The olives weren't quite up to Rossi standards, but they would do. I wasn't expecting to find such a well-stocked deli in such a small town, I told Thomas, the manager and owner, according to his name badge. "This place is a real find." "We knew," he told me, slipping a leaflet into a reusable bag bearing the shop logo. "We've only been open a few weeks, but business has been brisk so far." "How exciting," I nodded, looking around. "Sorry," I said, squeezing closer to the counter when I realised there was someone trying to get by.
"You look as though you've got the ingredients for a great dinner there," said the other customer, flashing me a smile as he looked over my shoulder. "I certainly hope so," I said, feeling my face colour a little as he handed a bottle of olive oil to a woman who was also serving. "Those grissini are delicious," he grinned. "I tried some last week."
"Excellent," I smiled back, taking in his blonde hair and deep blue eyes. "Nothing beats a personal recommendation?"
"That's very true," he agreed.
We ended up leaving at the same time, and as I was so weighed down with bags, he opened the door for me. "Thanks," I said, trying to evenly distribute everything. I definitely got far too much. I could probably cook Italian dishes for at least a fortnight, rather than the few days I was imagining I was going to be at Fenview Farm.
"Can you manage?"
the guy asked. "Not really," I admitted, "but I'm only going over there," I added with a nod to where Beck had parked.
"In that case," he said, holding out his hands, "let me help. I'm heading that way too."
He slipped his bottle of olive oil into one of the bags,
and we split the haul between us. Our fingers became entwined during the sorting, and he gave me an even wider smile. "Thanks," I swallowed. "This is very kind of you."
"It's no problem."
We crossed the road together, and I came to a stop behind Beck's dazzling ray of motorised sunshine.
"Nice car,"
laughed the guy who I had named in my head Mr. Helpful.
"Thanks,"
said Beck, suddenly appearing.
"I've had it since I passed my test years ago. Striking, isn't she?"
"Just a bit."
"I call her the Banana-mobile."
"Well,"
he said, putting down the bags,
"I'll certainly keep an eye out for her from now on."
I thanked him again, and then he climbed into the sporty Audi next to us, waved, and drove off. He'd forgotten to take his olive oil.
"Who was that?"
Beck wistfully asked, looking after him with a soppy expression on her face.
"No idea,"
I told her. "He was in the deli and offered to help carry the shopping."
"Manners and beguiling good looks,"
she dreamily sighed, giving me a nudge.
"What a thrilling combo."
"If you say so," I laughed. Personally, I thought her big brother had the edge on that particular pairing, but obviously I wasn't going to tell her that.
"What's all this then?"
Beck asked, taking in the many bags around my feet.
"I thought you were cooking dinner for 5, not feeding the 5,000.
"I'm used to Italian portion control," I told her, pulling my phone out of my pocket.
"Or lack of it,"
she giggled. While Beck loaded the boot, I took advantage of the fact that my phone had enough signal for me to message Marco and give him an update on how the day had gone. I didn't go into any detail or brag to him about Elliot's bike, but I knew Alessandro and Nonna would take comfort in knowing that I was staying at the farm. It would suggest to them that all was well, and for now, that was the impression I was keen to convey. They didn't need to know about the muddle I'd made of my arrival. When we arrived back at the farm, Louise had gone home and Elliot was washing up. I wanted to ask what his mum had said to make him change his mind about me staying at the farm, but he seemed a bit distracted, and I hoped they hadn't had words. The last thing I wanted was to be a burden.
"I thought we were having fish and chips,"
he commented, as Beck and I finished decanting the contents of the bags onto the kitchen table.
"Fliss is going to cook for us instead,"
Beck told him.
"That's why she picked up all this lot."
"Oh," he said, "right."
"And this wasn't the only thing you picked up, was it, Fliss?"
she said with a much exaggerated wink. "I don't know what you're talking about," I tutted as I carefully set the bottle of olive oil Mr. Helpful had left behind to one side.
"Yes, you do," she persisted. "A side order of handsome and helpful isn't forgotten that quickly."
I shook my head, hoping she'd shut up, because I was pretty certain the spark I'd felt when I first set eyes on Elliot was mutual, and even if nothing was going to come of it, I didn't want him thinking that I went through life flirting with every man who crossed my path. Mr. Helpful might have been attractive, but in a completely different way to Elliot.
"So,"
said Elliot, thankfully ignoring his sister's silliness,
"what are you going to make?"
I reeled off the evening's menu, embellishing with a few words of Italian. Saying it out loud made my tummy rumble, and even just the thought of time spent stirring the creamy risotto soothed my soul.
"But Bill won't eat any of that,"
was Elliot's reaction, and it well and truly burst my bubble.
"Oh,"
I swallowed, my face flushed with embarrassment. So keen to comfort myself, I'd got carried away and only factored my tastes and preferences into the evening's dishes.
"I didn't think,"
I apologised.
"I'm sorry."
"Don't get me wrong," said Elliot, "it all sounds great, but your grandfather has a rather less sophisticated palate. He's more a meat and 2 veg kind of guy."
I felt a total fool.
"Which is why,"
said Beck, coming to my rescue and shooting her brother an accusatory look,
"I picked up some eggs and Skylark Farm bacon from the butcher. Bill will be happy with that."
"Yes, that's more like it,"
Elliot agreed.
"Though he's not got much of an appetite, and the meds are making him drowsy, so he probably won't want to eat anything anyway."
"So why make me feel bad about choosing the wrong thing?"
I snapped.
"I didn't mean to,"
Elliot said. He looked shocked by my outburst, and I was mortified to find myself instantly on the verge of tears. Beck looked daggers at her brother again.
"Sorry,"
I said. I didn't mean to bite your head off.
It's all right, he said. It's been one hell of a day. I'm feeling it myself.
That no doubt accounted for the change in his mood too.
You must be exhausted, and I could have put that better. I'm the one who should be apologising. I seem to have a habit of putting my foot in it today.
As relieved as I was that he hadn't meant to make me feel bad, at the same time, I wanted to tell him not to be nice to me either. Kindness and understanding would tip me completely over the edge. But because I didn't trust myself not to blub, I didn't. I think I'll just freshen up, I sniffed. Do I need to go upstairs? Elliot succinctly explained that there were 4 rooms upstairs, 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, and I rushed off, keen to have a minute to myself. I could hear Elliot and Beck talking in the kitchen below and made a mental note to talk in whispers whenever possible for the next few days in case my grandfather caught the sound of my voice. The doors to 2 of the bedrooms were closed, but the spare was open and the bed was made with my rucksack sitting next to it. Thanks to the open window, the room was filled with warm spring air, and I pushed the curtains further back to take in the far-reaching fenland view. I pulled out my phone and took a photo. The Rossies would love that. I would send it next time I had enough signal. I wasn't sure what I was expecting of Fenview Farm, but from what I could make out, it looked to be nowhere as big as the Rossies' plot. There were a couple of fields full of blossom-heavy trees, and I could see a few large cages filled with soft fruit bushes, as well as rows and rows of strawberry plants. There was no straw on any of them yet, but I knew that would have to go down soon. The season would be starting in just a few weeks. Sooner, if it stayed warm, and if the berries weren't going to be spoiled, then they'd need that straw buffer between them and the earth. Modern commercial farms grew the berries off the ground and under cover, but Fenview Farm looked distinctly old school, and I felt my back groan at the thought of bending and filling punnets. I would no doubt be long gone before they ripened, but it didn't stop my body reacting to the thought of the back-breaking work. I wondered who my grandfather would get to pick them. That was one job his new hip wouldn't be up to so soon. I looked back to the orchards. Even from this distance, I could make out that they weren't quite so tidily kept as some I'd seen on my journey from Peterborough, but they weren't in as poor a state as others I'd glimpsed courtesy of Google. Was it really only a few hours since I'd been in the hotel and looking at these views online? It felt like a lifetime ago. My stomach growled again, and after freshening up, I pulled myself together, took a deep breath, and went back downstairs to set about preparing my Italian feast. "That," said Beck as she wiped her mouth on her napkin, "was the best meal I've eaten in forever." I was delighted she had enjoyed it. I had soon found my way around the brown kitchen and had loved preparing the food as much as eating it. Losing myself in the familiarity of it all was exactly what I needed after a stress-filled few hours, and insisting that we eat outside on our laps as the weather was so wonderful had made it all the better.
"I have to agree with you, sis,"
said Elliot, stretching back in his chair and rubbing his hands over his tummy, which still looked washboard flat in spite of all the carbs he'd crammed in.
"That was phenomenal, Fliss.
Where did you learn to cook like that?" I flushed at the compliment which found its way straight to my heart. I was never happier than when folk were enjoying my food, and I knew Nonna would have been proud. Not from her mother, that's for sure. Louise, who had come back to join us, laughed. From what I can remember from cooking at school, Jennifer was as good at burning toast then as I am now. Mum and Louise really had gone a long way back then.
"You've got a lot more going for you than being able to find your way around a kitchen, Mum," said Elliot, closing his eyes.
"Just as well," she laughed, "because I can't."
"And before you think it, Fliss,"
Elliot quickly said, opening his eyes again,
"that wasn't me saying that's all you've got going for you. Although even if it was, that'd be no bad thing because that meal was amazing. I mean, I know you can do more than cook. Not that it would matter if you—"
"Elliot," Bea squawked.
"What?"
"For pity's sake, shut up." "I learned to cook in Italy," I said, answering Beck's question and pretending I hadn't noticed that Elliot had got himself in a muddle again. "And I had the most amazing teacher."
A vision of me wearing one of Nonna's aprons, standing next to her at the old stove and stirring a vast pot of rich tomato sauce popped into my head, and yet another prickle of tears accompanied it. When I'd decided to come and find the farm, I hadn't taken into account that as well as still missing Mum, I'd be bereft without the Rossis too. "Tell us about them," said Louise, settling back in her chair.
"Another day," I sniffed, standing up. "I'd best get tidied up."
"Oh, no you don't," said Beck. "You cook this feast, we'll tidy up."
"I'd better check on Bill first," said Elliot. "And I need to get the bike under cover."
"Any excuse to get out of the washing up," tutted his sister. "I really don't mind helping," I said. "You stay where you are," said Louise. "Sit back down, have another glass of wine, and enjoy the sunset." The Fenland spring sunset really was a sight to behold. The cloud-streaked sky turned gold and then orange as the great orb slipped gently towards the horizon, and then slowly sank below it. I closed my eyes, listening to the chatter of a robin, which was swiftly followed by a blackbird. He sounded keen to announce the farm as his own. It was all every bit as tranquil as Puglia, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I thought about how there might be a possibility of my roots working their way into the soft, dark earth beneath my feet. It was probably down to the wine, but it was a settling sensation nonetheless.
"I'm not asking you to pay for it. I'm giving it to you for free."
My eyes snapped open. There was a chill in the air, but someone had laid a blanket over me so I hadn't felt it. The dishes had all been cleared away, along with my empty wineglass, and I could see the drive was empty. Elliot must have put his bike away, and Beck and Louise had gone home. I was sorry not to have said goodbye, but I hadn't heard a thing. I must have been out for the count.
"Yes, mate, I know. And believe me, I was looking forward to it too, but it can't be helped."
I wondered who Elliot was talking to.
"I've asked Beck to forward you the booking email, and I'll let the organiser know you're taking my spot. You'll need your insurance documents." "OK, well, have fun. And do not even think about stopping by here on the way back to tell me how it went."
He ended the conversation, and I called over to him, momentarily forgetting I was supposed to be keeping quiet. "Everything all right?"
"Yeah,"
he said, wandering over with the phone from the kitchen still in his hand.
"Just a change of plan for tomorrow."
"Oh," I yawned. "What were you supposed to be doing?"
"A track day on the bike. It's been in the diary for months."
"I'm sorry you've had to cancel," I said. "You must be really disappointed."
"Yeah, well," he shrugged. "There'll be other days, but there's only one Bill."
I smiled, but didn't know what to say to that.
"What about you?" he asked. "Had you got anything planned you need to call off now you're staying?"
"No," I said. "I came to England with the sole purpose of doing this. Not that I expected it to work out the way it has so far."
"It must have been quite a shock, finding out about this place."
"Yes," I said, "it was. Come to that, it still is, and I'd no idea it was going to be just my grandfather here on his own."
"And I dare say you're going to be in for a few more surprises, given that you still know so little,"
Elliot pointed out. "Thanks for that," I said, giving him a rueful smile.
"Sorry,"
he smiled back.
"I don't know what it is about you, Fliss, but you do seem to get me tongue-tied in double-quick time. Nothing I've said to you today has come out right, has it?"
"No," I sighed, trying not to think of his tongue. "Not really."
"Come on," he said, holding out his hand. "You go up to bed and I'll lock up."
I rested my hand in his, and as he pulled me to my feet, an explosion of fireworks coursed through my system and turned my knees to jelly.
"You all right?"
he asked, resting his other hand under my elbow to steady me. "Too much wine and not enough sleep," I bluffed, taking a step away. "Night, Elliot."
"Night, Fliss,"
he huskily replied.
"Sleep well."
End of CD 2. CD 3.
Chapter 6. I had no idea whether it was the wine, the emotion of the day, or Elliot's warm nighttime wishes, but I slept surprisingly well. The unfamiliar mattress and inner turmoil didn't impact at all, and I was up with the lark and feeling refreshed early the next morning. I was grateful for the early start too, because the Fenland sunrise was every bit as spectacular as the sunset. I quietly made myself a coffee and, wrapped in the blanket from the night before, crept outside to enjoy a calm, slow and steady start to the day. I was feeling wonderfully relaxed after some mindful meditation and ready to face whatever the day threw at me, but when I went back inside, my tranquil state immediately took flight.
"Oh, for fuck's sake,"
gulped Elliot, who was filling the kettle at the sink and wearing nothing but his boxers.
"Where did you spring from? I thought you were still asleep."
"I've been outside," I said, trying to keep my eyes on his face and stop myself from laughing because he had jumped almost as high as the ceiling. "I wanted to see the sunrise. How did you sleep?"
"Badly,"
he muttered, thumping down the kettle and flicking it on.
"Bill was awake all night and now he's out for the count."
"Oh," I said. I don't suppose it mattered when my grandfather slept, but it was tough on Elliot. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was even more mussed up after the night spent tossing and turning than it had been when he'd worn his bike helmet. "That's not great, then. But do you think he's getting any better?"
"Maybe."
He yawned, rubbing his eyes.
"Perhaps, I don't know."
"Look," I gently said, wishing he'd at least sit down so I couldn't see quite so much of him. "You're exhausted. Why don't you go back to bed for a bit?"
"No,"
he said, running a hand up and down his bare chest before arching his back.
"I'll be all right. Besides, the floor isn't all that comfy."
"Then take your sleeping bag and lie on the bed I slept in," I suggested, "and I'll listen out for my grandfather."
"No,"
he said more firmly.
"You're all right. I'll be fine when I've had a coffee."
"A shower, then?" I brightly proposed. "That, combined with the caffeine, might make you feel a bit brighter."
"Are you insinuating that I'm not my usual sunny self this morning?"
he asked, one eyebrow cocked. "Not at all," I said, looking away. "Well, a bit. But then if I'd spent the night on the floor, I'd probably be feeling a bit jaded too." What I wouldn't be, though, was walking about the house half-dressed. Elliot didn't seem in the slightest bit bothered that the one item of clothing he was wearing left very little to the imagination, but then with a body like that...
"All right," he relented. "I'll go and shower. You keep an ear out for Bill, but whatever you do, do not disturb him, okay?"
What did he think I was going to do? Rush in and shake him awake? I might have wanted to be useful, but after what had happened the day before, I would most definitely be avoiding implementing the element of surprise. In the few minutes it took Elliot to get showered and dressed, and with one eye on my slumbering relative, I made a list of all the dishes I could cook with the leftover ingredients from my culinary shopping spree the day before, and got some breakfast on the go. Elliot reappeared, smelling and looking great, and the smile that lit up his face when he saw I had buttered bread, made more coffee, had bacon sizzling on the grill, and the biggest eggs frying on the hob, made me feel as smug as Nigella. "I thought you might like some breakfast," I said, setting out the plates which had been warming on the stove. "And I know my grandfather didn't eat last night, so he might fancy something too."
"I'll have some," he said, "but Bill's going to be asleep for a good while yet."
I looked back at the hob. There was definitely too much food for two.
"But don't worry," Elliot said, rising to the challenge. "I'll make short work of it."
Where on earth did he put it all? I wondered, then hastily decided not to ponder.
"Are you cooking bacon in there?"
My grandfather suddenly called out, making us jump.
"I could go for a bit of that, and an egg or two if there are any."
"Sounds like you won't get the chance," I whispered, with a smile on my lips. I turned my attention back to the pan and competently flipped the eggs, feeling thankful for Nonna Rossi's the bigger the better opinion on portion size.
"He's demolished the lot,"
Elliot told me when he came back in carrying a tray bearing 2 empty plates and mugs a little while later.
"And he's had all the tea too."
I was pleased to note that he hadn't left a scrap of anything either. "Well, that's good," I said, feeling well satisfied.
Nonna's cookery lessons had not only equipped me with the knowledge to fill plates with delicious food, but also to feel the satisfaction of seeing them empty too. He must be feeling more like himself if he's eating and drinking so much.
It's a definite improvement, that's for sure,
Elliot agreed. And has he mentioned anything about yesterday? I steeled myself to ask.
About you mean?
Yes.
No, not a word. I reckon you've got away with it.
Thank goodness for that. I sighed, feeling relieved.
You'll be able to introduce yourself in no time,
Elliot then said, pushing my nervousness back up the scale again.
Don't look so worried. He's a really great guy.
If he was that great, then why had Mum left him all those years ago? I didn't think there was much point asking Elliot. Louise was more likely to have the answer, although she hadn't offered it up yesterday. Not that it had been the day for further revelations and explanations. My turning up had been more than enough to contend with, for all of us.
Dr. Clark rang earlier to say she's coming out again later.
On a Sunday? I asked. Given what he'd said yesterday, I didn't think my grandfather would be particularly pleased to see her again so soon.
She's on call and said she might as well pop in as she's bound to be passing. She'll take another look at Bill and then we can decide how to take things after that.
All right, I agreed. I supposed that did sound like small enough steps for me to be able to manage. That's a good idea.
Maybe you could go and take a walk around the farm for a bit while she's here?
That was another good idea. I guess that would save any awkward questions, wouldn't it? I nodded. She'd probably want to know why the stranger from yesterday is still hanging about, wouldn't she?
Definitely, Elliot nodded. Nothing gets past Dr. Clark.
In that case, I said, squirting washing up liquid into the sink, I'll get this lot sorted and head straight out.
Great,
said Elliot, making to walk out. Tea towel is right there, Elliot, I said, nodding to the hook where it hung.
Right.
He grinned, giving me a nudge.
I'll dry up then, shall I?
I made sure I was well out of the way by the time Dr. Clark's car turned into the yard, and I was careful not to walk anywhere near where I guessed the dining room window was too. Having managed to find a spot where my phone picked up an iota of signal, I typed out another message for Marco to relay to Nonna and Alessandro and attached the photo I'd taken the day before. I would have liked to hear their voices, but neither my Italian family nor I had WhatsApp downloaded, and, unsure of the cost of a call, decided not to risk it. Before I started pining for them too much, or letting the sharp pain of missing Mum get the better of me again, I reminded myself why I was here, and strode out to what I thought was the furthest point of the farm boundary, and looked about me properly. Right, I said to Mum, as I patted the pocket which had her letter and Nonna's recipe in. Let's see why you thought I might like this place, shall we? It didn't take long to work out. I knew it wouldn't be the same as it had been 30 years ago, but I could see there was plenty of work to be done, which backed up what Elliot had said about my grandfather having not been able to keep on top of it for the last couple of years. That said, it was a lovely spot, and potentially very productive. As I walked about, I imagined myself getting stuck into what needed doing. I had worked on fruit farms across Europe and in the UK, and there didn't appear to be anything beyond my skill set. But would my grandfather want me helping out if I did decide to stay on for a while? The evening before, I had imagined potential tender new roots anchoring me to this place, but should I allow them to sink down if there was a chance that my grandfather might slice straight through them when he found out who I was? I slowed my breathing and reminded myself about those tiny steps I was supposed to be taking. There was no point in trying to look too far ahead because I couldn't see that far. No one could. You must remember to live in the moment, Fliss, I heard Mum dreamily say as she drifted through my mind, reclined on a patchouli-scented cloud. Just go with the flow. Yes, I said, out loud. Well, I'll try. As I'd surmised from the bedroom window, the farm wasn't at its best, but there was nothing that couldn't be fixed with hard work and commitment. In the right hands, the neglect could be turned around in no time. Everything was salvageable, and it was a credit to my grandfather that it was only at this point, after a couple of slack years.
I could tell that everything would have been perfect before his hip gave up on him, because had it not been, the state of things would have been far worse. I inspected the rows of trees in the orchards, admiring the light as it filtered through those in blossom. The apple, pear, plum and few cherry trees would produce a decent enough harvest, even though the apples and pears were in need of some pruning. I soon discovered the soft fruit would be fine too, as long as the holes in the cages were repaired before the birds found their way in and stripped the lot. On closer inspection, I could see that the netting needed completely replacing. Some areas were definitely more hole than net, but that was a job for later in the year. Completely removing the covers when the harvest was over would make weeding easier and also encourage the birds to pick off any bugs and clear up any rotting fruit. There was a healthy abundance of raspberry canes, as well as gooseberry, black and red currant bushes. There were blackberries outside of the cages too, along with the long rows of established strawberry plants. Second to the cage repairs, they needed the most urgent attention. It was important to get the straw on as soon as possible, and I wondered where that was usually sourced. Even though it wasn't my place to, I automatically made mental notes of everything as I walked back to the yard and pondered over how farming in the area had changed in recent years and how the place could financially stay afloat in the future. I was aware that in the fairly recent past, a farm the size of Fen View would have been a common sight as well as a competitive and profitable prospect. The Fens had been dotted with dozens of places of similar acreage who all took their harvests to the local auction houses to sell on a daily or weekly basis, depending on the crop and the season, but those days were long gone. Even using locally sourced and grown as a USP was no longer entirely enough for a small farm to compete in the large commercial market. My grandfather must have been horribly aware of that, and assuming that he kept tabs on his finances, known that the farm income was feeling the pinch. What, realistically, was the future of this place going to be? As a small-scale farm, it wasn't likely to still be turning a profit. Not enough of one to comfortably live off anyway. If Fen View Farm was going to keep afloat, then it was going to need to do more than just sell fruit. Did my grandfather have long-term plans for it, or hadn't he thought that far ahead? "Well, hello, Puss," I said, bending to stroke a rather thin ginger and white cat who ran towards me with its tail standing to attention. "Where did you spring from?" I hadn't seen the ragged little scrap before, and wondered if it was a stray. It clearly wasn't feral, because it would have pelted in the opposite direction when it spotted me. "Who do you belong to, then?" It decided it had had enough of me and trotted jauntily over to the brick-built barn which sat at the far side of the drive. I watched in amusement as the cat walked through a hole in the bottom of the door which had obviously been sawn there for that purpose. "What's in here, then?" I mused, following the cat, sliding the bolt and trying the handle on the huge arched wooden door, which, to my surprise, was unlocked. I tugged the door open and slipped inside. Wow! The barn was bigger inside than I expected, with beautiful wooden beams, and it was currently being used as a storage space. Intrigued, I pulled the doors further back, coughing as dust motes filled the air, and my eyes adjusted to the change in light level. The cat looked at me accusingly from its perch atop some straw bales. It clearly wasn't impressed about having its home invaded. Along with the bales, there were old bits of machinery, a few ancient tools, and half a dozen or so tea chests and larger boxes. They were filled with what looked like old Fenland paraphernalia. I had researched the history of the Fens a little, as well as fruit farming, when I had been on the coach from the airport to Peterborough, and could therefore recognise the willow-woven eel traps and a few of the tools, and it was obvious what the ice skates were. I wondered if they had been used for competing when the winters had been cold enough for the flooded meadows to freeze. They certainly looked old enough, but what were they doing in the barn? What was any of this stuff doing here? "Fliss?" Elliot's voice rang out across the yard. So much for keeping my presence under wraps. If he carried on bellowing, my grandfather wouldn't be in any doubt that the impostor who had upset him was still in the vicinity. Assuming he could remember. Elliot had suggested he wouldn't, and I really hoped he was right. It was far better for my nerves if I agreed with him about that. "Coming!" I shouted back, although not quite so loudly. I pushed the barn doors closed again and went back to the house. "Whose is the cat?" I asked, when I was close enough to not have to shout.
The mangy ginger and white thing.
"It's not mangy, it's sweet."
It's Bill's, he said, but it's not a house cat. It lives outdoors, and you might not think it, but it's a great ratter.
My body emitted an involuntary shudder.
She's not afraid of taking down a rat, even though they're bigger than she is.
"Oh, crikey," I said. "I would be. I hate them."
"Yes," said Elliot, matching my shudder with one of his own. "Me too. It's the naked tails that make my flesh crawl."
"And mine. So what did the doctor have to say?" I quickly asked, keen to change the subject. Could she see any improvement?
"Definitely. She's told Bill to take the whole week's worth of antibiotics to be sure the infection goes, and now he's not so confused, I'll be able to get him out of bed and doing his exercises again soon."
"Can you manage to do that on your own?"
"Yes, no problem."
I was relieved about that.
"But even though he's well on the mend,"
Elliot carried on,
"I still think it would be best to give him another day or so before you introduce yourself."
I was relieved about that too. The rest of Sunday ticked slowly by, and by mid-afternoon, thoughts of Mum's last few days and of what the Rossis were doing were beginning to plague me as they always did when I had nothing to do. I'd cooked as much as I could, but I hadn't felt the usual unadulterated pleasure I generally derived from time at the stove because I had to be careful about staying quiet and out of view as Elliot flitted in and out. I'd had to try and contain the delicious smells too. None of that had been an issue the evening before because my grandfather had been fast asleep. But now caution was the watchword, and I was feeling tense. Rather than give in to my anxiety, I took a notepad I'd found on the kitchen dresser and began to doodle and jot a few things down. I made detailed lists of all the jobs around the farm that needed doing, prioritising those such as strawing the strawberries and fixing the fruit cages, which were most urgent. Then, having filled one side of the A4 sheet and decorated it around the edges with a border of roughly sketched strawberries and leaves, I then began to scribble down ideas which could help the farm turn more of a profit. Obviously it was only for fun, but it helped pass more time and occupied my mind. Increasing yields or growing different crops wasn't an option because, as far as I had seen, the farm didn't have space to expand. I would have to ask Elliot if there was more land attached to the place than that which surrounded the house, though, just to be sure. I thought again of the barn, with its mellow bricks, attractively arched doors and lofty interior, as well as the collection of vintage paraphernalia someone had squirreled away inside. Was there any value in any of that, I wondered? Not in selling it necessarily, but in finding a way to utilise it. I wrote down venue in large capitals and then listed what was currently fashionable in alternative uses for farm buildings, assuming you could secure the official change to its use and any subsequent planning permission, of course. Weddings were the obvious choice, but the Fenview barn wasn't big enough to make it worthwhile, and there was no space for decent parking. 12 vehicles max, and the yard would be rammed. And more to the point, I couldn't imagine my grandfather in the role of wedding planner. Hiring the space out to another farmer or even a landscaper looking for machinery storage might be an easier option, and then there were the residential conversion opportunities, as long as you didn't mind someone living practically on your doorstep. That would most likely mean selling it, but I added it anyway. I did another quick doodle, then added farm shop to the list along with Fenland Museum. I was scraping the barrel a bit by then, but the unusual collection had stuck in my head. It was obviously there for a reason and meant something to someone.
"What's this?"
asked Elliot, leaning over my shoulder and making me jump.
"Possible diversification ideas?"
"It's nothing," I said, turning the paper over. "I was just thinking about things that could help get the farm back on its feet."
"What makes you think it needs any help?"
he said, sounding a little defensive. "Well, I've seen a few things about the place that need attention, so I've written them down."
"What sort of things?"
"Well, the fruit cages, for a start," I told him, feeling my temperature rise under his inquisition. A couple of them are torn, and if the birds get in, then the protection might as well not be there.
What else?
The strawberry rows need strawing to stop the fruit from resting on the soil and getting spoiled in the rain, I said, referring to the second thing on my list.
And how do you know about any of this stuff? He asked, nodding at the notes I'd made. What do you know about running a fruit farm?
There was a definite narky edge to his tone, and I thought it had more bite behind it than just being nudged to the fore by a sleepless night. You'd be surprised. I found myself snapping back.
And what's all this? He asked, taking up the paper and turning it over. Wedding venue, barn conversion, farm shop, he reeled off. Got plans of your own for Fenview Farm, have you?
No, I said, further taken aback by the unkind accusation. Of course not. I hoped he didn't think that I had travelled to Winbridge with a potential inheritance in mind. That's not what I had come to Fenview for at all. I was just doing it to fill the time, that's all, I quickly explained. This, I said, pointing at the paper he still held, is just my way of letting my mind wander. I need to keep busy. It stops me thinking.
About what?
He cut in. My mother's last moments, I choked. Watching her last breath leave her body, seeing the light leave her eyes, walking to the grave behind her coffin.
Shit.
Elliot swore, dropping the paper back on the table. Knowing I'll never feel her arms round me again.
Stop, he said, pulling out the chair next to mine and sitting on it. Please, Fliss.
Well, you asked. You clearly wanted me to justify the silly scribbles, didn't you? You wanted me to prove that I haven't rocked up here with a view to trying to secure myself a Fenland future.
No, he said, hanging his head. No, of course not.
Well, that's what it sounded like to me.
Fuck,
he said, and then he was back on his feet and pulling me along with him.
Come here.
He wrapped his arms tight around me, and my body melded to his in spite of my vain attempt to resist. I was too wound up to cry, and too shocked by his proximity to feel anything other than annoyance. If there had been a spark between us the day before, then for the time being at least, he had succeeded in snuffing it out.
I'm sorry,
he said, his breath close to my ear.
I just worry about Bill. He's so vulnerable right now, and I just want to
protect him, I said, pulling away. I know, but you really don't need to protect him from me. We looked at each other, as an uncomfortable awkwardness filled the space between us. I'm going for a run, I said. Maybe you should think about taking a nap. It was a good couple of miles before I had even started to work my way out of the upset Elliot's reaction to my note-making had shoved me into, and even then it still stung. I could appreciate the second part of my list could have been open to misinterpretation, but it was the fact that he had reacted with such instant suspicion which had taken me aback. Granted, he didn't know me yet, but he could have framed his curiosity about what I had been scribbling so much better. He might have looked buff in boxers, but thinking so badly of me had turned me off him a bit. I picked up the pace again and turned back towards the farm, smashing my PB as the farmhouse came into view. My heart was hammering and my breath was sharp in my chest by the time I drew level with the gate.
Hey,
called a voice as I began to stretch out my muscles.
Where's the fire?
I pulled out my earbuds and spun around, abandoning the series of extra-long stretches I always did after a really hard run. Mr. Helpful and his sleek Audi had crept up behind me, and I hadn't heard a thing. I never usually played my music so loud for fear of not hearing traffic, but Elliot had got me so fired up I'd shot the volume up as soon as I set off. Oh, hey, I puffed, still breathing hard.
That was some serious speed you gathered back there.
He beamed, taking off his sunglasses and unashamedly looking at my legs. I didn't usually run in shorts, but they were the only thing remotely suitable for exercise that I had with me. That and the halter-neck top I had teamed them with. Fortunately, I'd got my running shoes because I never went anywhere without those. I thought I'd better make the effort to burn off all those calories I'd ingested after my spree in the deli, I said, making a joke even though I still didn't feel much in the mood for a laugh.
You look just fine to me, he said seriously.
I knew my face was already flushed, and was pleased he couldn't see that I was blushing. You left your olive oil in my bag,
I said, neatly sidestepping his comment. You can come and get it if you like. I wasn't sure what Elliot would make of me inviting a stranger in, but given that I was still smarting over our almost argument, I wasn't all that concerned.
What, from here?
Asked Mr. Helpful, looking at the farm. Yes.
Are you staying here?
Sort of, I said, wrinkling my nose as I realised that I'd put my foot in it again and let another local know I had a connection to the place too soon.
Well, either you are or you aren't, he laughed. Unless, of course, you're squatting. Is that what you're doing?
It did feel a bit like that. In a roundabout sort of way, I sighed as I looked along the road and spotted the banana-mobile heading in our direction. I suppose I am. He noticed my gaze had shifted and checked his mirror.
Oh, crikey, he grinned. You can't miss that thing, can you?
Absolutely not. I smiled. This time the reaction felt far more genuine. I wouldn't be surprised if it glowed in the dark. So, do you want to come in and get this oil?
It'll have to be another day, I'm afraid.
If you're sure.
Absolutely. It'll be a good excuse to bump into you again.
Do you need one? I laughed. I realised with a jolt that I was flirting. So out of practice, I thought I'd lost the ability. And I had no idea why I was doing it. Perhaps it was some sort of reflex to Elliot's meanness.
I guess not, he grinned. I'll see you around.
He put the car into gear and smoothly pulled away. Yes, I called after him. I'll see you around. It was only then that I realised that I still hadn't found out who he was. Chapter 7. It didn't make any difference to me, but Monday was a bank holiday, and that did have an impact on Elliot.
I have to go out,
he told me, when I eventually went down to the kitchen, dressed and stiff-legged, to seek out some coffee. I'd avoided spending time with him the afternoon and evening before. He'd apologised profusely for his suspicious snappiness more than once, and I had accepted it, but I didn't much like the change in atmosphere the misunderstanding had left behind, so I absented myself from it and stayed upstairs on the excuse of being tired. Which wasn't an excuse really, because the previous day's events had been exhausting. Oh, I said, my nerves instantly jangling at the thought of being left home alone, in case my grandfather needed anything while he was gone. Right.
I'm not going to be long,
Elliot elaborated, picking up on my apprehension.
So don't worry. I just need to collect some meds for Bill that I hadn't realised he was running low on, and as it's a bank holiday, the pharmacy in town is shut, so I've got to go to the one in the big Waitrose in Peterborough.
All right, I nodded, trying to look more in control than I felt, as he pulled on his leather suit. Here's hoping you won't be needed before you get back.
I promise I'll be as quick as I can.
I didn't much want him to ride fast, but a speedy turnaround would be appreciated. You're going to be hot wearing that, I said, with a nod to the suit. For a British bank holiday, the weather felt unseasonably warm, and that was inside the house.
That's as maybe,
he said, wriggling his shoulders to get the suit to slide more comfortably into place before offering me a cheeky smile.
But I don't ride without protection.
I couldn't help but laugh. Honestly, Elliot, I said primly, but with a smile. Well, that's good to know. He laughed back, and even though I was nervous about him leaving, I was relieved that the awkward feeling between us had been banished. I busied myself making coffee and toast while he pulled on the cumbersome boots which filled the space by the back door.
I won't be long,
he said again, reaching for his helmet and gloves.
Bill's asleep, and fingers crossed he'll stay that way. I'll push the bike down the road a bit before I start it, and the window in his room is shut, so he shouldn't hear it.
He was going to great lengths to ensure everything should run like clockwork, and I appreciated that. All right, I said, and don't worry about how long it takes, just ride safe. The roads are bound to be extra busy today, and not all car drivers have their minds on bikes when they're in a rush, do they?
Unfortunately not, he agreed. I've had my share of near misses.
I didn't like the thought of him having to take evasive action as he sped along the Poker Straight A47. It seemed to me to be just the sort of road that could easily catch you out if you didn't have your wits about you.
See you later then.
He smiled, ducking out the door. Even though he pushed the heavy bike a good way along the road before he started it, it was still loud and barely out of earshot before I heard my grandfather moving about. I crossed my fingers and sent up a quick prayer in the hope that I wasn't in for a repeat of what happened when Vicky left on Saturday.
I know you're still here,
he called, making my feet leave the floor before I'd even uttered an amen.
So you might as well come in.
I stood stock still, barely daring to breathe and wishing I'd prayed faster. That said, maybe it was Elliot that he was referring to.
Come on, young woman. Show yourself.
Or maybe not. Elliot was as far from womanly as it was possible to get.
Quick now, came the voice again, or am I going to have to come and find you myself?
I dithered for a second and then, knowing I couldn't risk him getting out of bed unaided, popped my head into the room.
Good morning, he said. The enigma reveals itself at last.
Good morning, I blurted out, my voice ridiculously squeaky and high. I'm here to help Elliot, Mr. Brown. I'm a trainee. He's gone to get you some tablets, but he'll be back in a minute. Why don't you just go to sleep? I don't think I'd ever spoken so fast.
I know exactly when he'll be back, he calmly told me. I'm capable of working out how long it takes him to get to Peterborough and back on that death trap he rides. I've been waiting for him to go. Just because my eyes are closed, neither of you should assume I'm asleep, you know.
He'd obviously overheard mine and Elliot's every word. I wondered what else he'd been privy to. At least he wasn't shouting anymore, though.
If you're serious about pursuing a career in caring,
he added, his eyes twinkling,
then you should remember that.
I will, I nodded, playing along. That's good to know, thank you, duly noted.
And you should always have the kettle on the boil too, he said with a sniff. I generally have a cup of tea about now. I wouldn't mind something to eat to go with it, if that's all right with you.
As I boiled a couple of eggs and buttered bread, I tried not to think about what was going to happen next. I was in no way prepared to keep telling lies because that would only cause more problems in the long run. But I wasn't ready for the conversation about my true identity, which seemed to be nudging closer either. I had no idea what Elliot was going to say when he got back and found I'd been playing out the caring role, but I could hardly have ignored my grandfather's calls, could I? Elliot would have been far unhappier if I'd left him to find me and he'd taken a tumble. Here we go then, Mr. Brown, I said, trying to smile as I wobbled my way back into the room with the breakfast tray. How about some boiled eggs to kick your day off? I was probably overdoing the upbeat tone, but I was nervous. I hoped I didn't sound patronising. If I was, my grandfather was thankfully willing to let it pass.
Perfect,
he said, grimacing a little as he shifted himself further up the bed.
Just the thing. Thank you very much.
I'll leave you to it then, I said, hastily turning away.
No, don't go,
he said, deftly slicing the tops off the eggs.
Stay and talk. I could do with a bit of different conversation.
I'll just grab my coffee then, I said, my breath tight in my chest. I took a moment to compose myself, and when I went back in, I noticed how stuffy the room felt. With the curtains closed, it was dull too. It reflected nothing of the bright and sunny May bank holiday morning that was unfolding outside, and with the added smell of the eggs it made my nose wrinkle. Mr. Brown, I said, would you mind if I opened the curtains?
Not at all,
he keenly replied,
and some fresh air wouldn't hurt. I know Elliot's been keeping the curtains closed in case I spotted you walking about, and that the window has been shut this morning so I didn't hear his blasted bike. But as he's gone now, and you're in here, we don't have to worry about any of that, do we?
He really did have it all sussed out. I tried not to think about what else he already knew, or at least suspected. I take it you're not a fan of the Ducati then? I said, putting down my mug. He sounded even more scathing than Alessandro, who appreciated the power and beauty of the machine, but was also adamant that Marco would never ride one. Conversely, my grandfather didn't sound at all in awe of the bike's esteemed credentials. His tone was a much better match for nonnas.
No, he bluntly said, I'm not.
I rattled the curtains back along the pole and threw the window open. "Ah," he said, drawing in a breath of the sweetly fragrant air which rushed in. "That's more like it." The atmosphere in the room instantly lifted. No longer a sick room, it felt light and fresh. "Can I smell roses?" I asked, catching their heady scent as the sunlight streamed in. "You can," he proudly said. "The back of the house is covered with climbers, and they flower early thanks to the sheltered spot. With the sun on them, they smell like that all day." I hadn't seen them when I made my tour of the farm because I'd avoided the back of the house. "They smell wonderful," I said, inhaling deeply as he smiled in approval. "Oh," I added, "now we're in trouble." Having spotted an opportunity, the little cat had jumped nimbly through the window and straight up onto the bed. "Elliot told me she's not a house cat." I frowned, wondering how she would react if I tried to lift her off the bed or shoo her out. "Shall I try and put her out again?" "No," my grandfather said. "She won't do any harm, and to tell you the truth, I've missed seeing her. But the lad's right, she's not usually one for coming in, so I guess she must have been missing me too." It didn't take him long to finish his breakfast, and by the time I returned from clearing up and making more drinks, the cat was curled up on his lap, purring away and looking every bit like the feline who'd got the cream. Louise had told me my grandfather wasn't really a grumpy old man, and the way he fussed and tenderly coddled the cat suggested she was right. "Do you think she's hungry?" I asked, as he stroked her back, covering the pristine bed linen with a fine layer of cat hair. "No," he said. "I wouldn't have thought so. She's pretty self-sufficient." I shuddered at the thought of her rat-catching capabilities. "What about you?" I asked, keen to dismiss the image as I sat in the chair next to the bed. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Brown?" "No, thank you," he said. "I'm fine. In fact, this is the first time in a while that I've felt properly like myself." Thankfully, he bore absolutely no resemblance to the confused old man I'd seen shouting and flailing about the day I arrived. His brow was smooth, his manner relaxed, and there was even some colour in his cheeks. "You aren't feeling the cold, are you?" I asked, worried that the rosiness could be the result of the air which might have felt fresh to someone who had been indoors for a while. "No," he said. "I'm cosy enough with all these blankets, although I still can't get properly comfortable. What I wouldn't give for a night in my own bed, and how Elliot has stuck it on the floor I'll never know." "He's a saint, isn't he?" "He is that," my grandfather agreed, "and then some." I did suggest he could nap on the spare bed where I've been sleeping. His gaze shifted from the cat to my face. "Staying in the house, are you?" Damn! My nerves had started to dissipate, and in their place my ability to blurt had popped back up again. "Well, yes," I said, quickly composing myself, "just to make sure Elliot had some backup until you were over the worst. You've been very poorly, you know." I was quite proud of the speedy justification for my sleepover, and reminding my grandfather that he'd been properly poorly might make him think that what occurred on Saturday was just a dream. Assuming he could remember any of it, that is. "Well, that's very kind," he nodded, taking a moment to gauge my expression, which I kept as neutral as I could. "Clearly you've both gone above and beyond. Were you and Elliot an item by any chance?" My face flushed brightly enough to more than match his, and my regained composure and impartial appearance flew straight out the open window. "Why on earth would you think that?" I stuttered. "I thought I heard you having words yesterday." He smiled, and wondered if perhaps it was a lover's tiff, but given the look on your face, he added with a chuckle, "Perhaps not." "Absolutely not," I firmly said. "Our relationship is purely professional. We did have a slight disagreement about something yesterday, and I'm very sorry if it disturbed you." "No harm done," he shrugged, clearly amused by my reaction. I mentally crossed my fingers and toes, hoping he hadn't heard the cause of our raised voices. "That's very generous of you," I said, standing up again. "But I am sorry we bothered you. I think it would be best if I left you in peace now. Elliot and I won't disturb you again, Mr. Brown, and he'll be back to take over soon."
My grandfather looked at me and shook his head.
I think we can drop the title, don't you? Mr. Brown is a little on the formal side.
William, then. I smiled, thinking I'd got away with it. That's right, isn't it? I'll call you William or Bill.
Not Grandad.
For a second or two, the world seemed to stop turning. Then it started up again like a super slow-motion sequence beloved by movie makers before finally coming back into focus. I groped for the chair behind me and sank into it.
Grandad?
I swallowed. Why would I call you that?
Because you're my granddaughter. Aren't you?
He sounded completely unfazed by the pronouncement he had just made, but I was floundering. Should I deny who I was or confirm it? Was this the moment I had been waiting for? It didn't feel like the moment I had been waiting for. That moment was supposed to be decided upon by me, Elliot, and Louise. They were supposed to be holding my hands and helping me take those teeny tiny steps we'd talked about, and yet here I was with my grandfather, the very person we were trying to protect, and he was pulling me along the path and telling me to get a wriggle on and take bigger strides.
I've often wondered if Jennifer had a girl or a boy.
He further shocked me by saying,
if I had a granddaughter or a grandson somewhere in the world.
Tears prickled my eyes, and I looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze.
You knew she was pregnant?
I whispered.
I had a pretty good idea,
he quietly said. I couldn't bring myself to look at him.
I knew she'd had a holiday romance, he carried on, and you looked to be about the right age, and then of course there was your name. You told me Saturday that it's Felicity, didn't you? Same as my dear wife's. That's a bit of a coincidence, isn't it?
I didn't think you'd remember that,
I said, my voice constrained as I had to force the words over the lump in my throat.
I'm so sorry.
What are you apologising for?
I shrugged, unable to say that I was sorry his daughter, my mother, was dead, and that it had taken the acknowledgement of her impending demise for her to finally tell me that he existed. That could all come later.
You've got nothing to apologise for, he said. She was the one who ran away. I just want to know, are you my granddaughter, Felicity?
Yes,
I said, looking up at him through my tears.
Yes, I am. I am your granddaughter.
Chapter 8.
What do you mean he knows?
Elliot frowned as I relayed the details of what had happened in his absence. The supermarket pharmacy hadn't got the prescription ready when he had finally arrived, having heaved his way through the bank holiday traffic, and then there had been some mix-up which meant he'd had to call Dr. Clark, so he'd been gone ages and arrived back in a far less happy mood than the one he'd left in. My grandfather and I, or Grandad, as he was now insisting that I called him, hadn't got any further than establishing our relationship to one another, but that was more than enough for either of us to get our heads around, and looking at the expression on Elliot's face, and the colour that had flooded it as I explained what had happened, I realised that it was a shock for him too, coming straight on the back of his hot and tiresome trip out.
I can't believe it,
he grimaced as he tried to shrug himself out of his leather suit. His hair was plastered to his head, and his T-shirt clung to his chest. The outfit obviously wasn't easy to get off when he was so hot. As in temperature, I reminded myself as I looked anywhere but at his taut muscles straining to free themselves from their leather confines. Me neither, I told him. It turns out we hadn't been quite as clever or as quiet as we thought we had over the last couple of days. I didn't mention that Grandad had heard us arguing, because I didn't want to bring that particular topic back up again, but I did rush to grab the pile of papers, including my list, which the air blowing through the house had whipped up. And he'd worked out why the curtains were being kept shut, I added, thinking of the other clever deductions Grandad had made, which would have rivalled Hercule Poirot himself.
The canny old bugger,
Elliot tutted.
And why is it so breezy in here?
Because I've opened some windows, I told him, securing the papers with an empty mug.
Bill won't be used to this sudden change in temperature,
Elliot pointed out, making my desire to freshen things up a bit feel rather reckless.
It was hot in the hospital, and I've tried to replicate that here and bring it down gradually.
Damn, I'm so sorry, I said. I didn't think about that. I really needed to leave the caring side of things to Elliot. He was the expert, after all.
I take it you're another fresh air fiend? He asked.
Yes, I admitted. I suppose I am a bit, though not at the cost of Grandad's health, of course. Elliot looked at me and smiled. It wasn't quite the reaction I expected, given how hot and bothered he was. What? I asked.
It's nice to hear you call him Grandad, he softly said.
He was right. It was a little strange, but it felt good too. You aren't cross about what's happened then? I asked him.
Of course I'm not,
he said, laying a hand on my shoulder and making my heart skip. I wilted with relief. At least I think it was relief.
If anything, he said, letting out a breath, it's a weight off my mind, and I bet you feel the same, don't you? Bill working it all out has saved us a whole lot of heartache.
Yes, I said, lowering my voice to a barely audible whisper. It is a relief that he knows, but I'm still dreading telling him about Mum. That's going to have to happen sooner rather than later now, isn't it? Elliot gave my shoulder a squeeze.
Yeah,
he said, running his other hand through his hair.
I suppose it is. That's one conversation. Elliot! Called Grandad, cutting him off. Yes, Bill? Elliot called back. Can I have a word, please, lad?
Elliot looked at me and grimaced.
I'm going to be in the doghouse, he said. I bet I'm going to get an earful for not letting on about you.
Shall I come in with you? I offered. The last thing I wanted was for Grandad to blame Elliot for anything. After all, I was a grown woman, and had I really wanted to, I could have left on Saturday rather than given in to his and Louise's coaxing.
Best not, he said, standing tall. Better if I face the music alone.
I paced about the kitchen, unable to listen in on what was being said because the doors were closed, but there were no raised voices. I was certain I would have been able to hear if either of them was shouting. I kept purposefully busy and was hanging out the washing when Elliot came back out of the house. He was already wearing his leathers again, and obviously in a hurry. Oh, crikey, I said, throwing the handful of pegs back into the basket. He hasn't banished you, has he?
No, Elliot laughed. Nothing like that, and you can stop fretting because he didn't tell me off. Well, not quite. He was very understanding given the circumstances. He's aware of how poorly he was, and that if we'd said anything sooner, he wouldn't have been able to make head or tail of it.
That's a relief, then. But where are you off to in such a rush?
Vicky just called. There's not enough staff to do the rounds today, so I'm going to help out.
But you're on holiday, I pointed out.
I'm not really, though, am I?
He said, nodding back to the house.
I was already looking after Bill.
But who's going to look after him now? I panicked, thinking again of Saturday, even though I knew Grandad was much better. I don't know what to do with him.
You'll be fine,
Elliot said, climbing astride the bike in one swift and smooth movement. It was rather arousing, but I tried to focus on the matter in hand.
Bill's well on the mend. And you're my trainee, remember?
He added, waggling his eyebrows. Don't tease, I flushed. It's hardly the moment.
Well, he mercilessly carried on, Bill did say that you were keen to point out that our relationship was purely professional.
Did he? I said, turning red again.
Which is a shame,
Elliot said, his eyes meeting mine and causing my heart to judder.
Because I thought there was a bit of a spark between us.
Did you?
I squeaked. I did,
he huskily said, making me tingle.
I still do.
I self-consciously scuffed at the ground with the toe of my plimsoll and felt about 13. I'd sensed he'd felt something that first time he'd clapped eyes on me, and it was a thrill to know my spark was reciprocated. Perhaps we might, as Grandad had put it, become an item at some point in the future.
But you were right, Fliss.
Elliot then burst my loved-up bubble by saying,
given the circumstances, what with me being Bill's carer and you having only just arrived, we should keep things on a professional footing. It wouldn't do any good to start something up when you've still got so much to discover and deal with, would it?
I suppose not, I reluctantly agreed. I imagined my fiery sparkler being shoved into a bucket of sand before I had even drawn so much as a love heart with it. Its sparkling charm was completely extinguished.
You and Bill are going to be having some difficult conversations and working through some tricky times, and what you'll both need more than anything is a friend, isn't it?
Elliot carried on.
And I'd really like to be that person, Fliss, for you as well as him.
It was an extremely kind offer, and given the limited number of people I knew here in Winbridge, I considered myself most fortunate to have Elliot's wonderfully broad shoulders to cry on. I knew I could call the Rossies and tell them what was happening, but a proper hug and a sympathetic ear close by was going to be much appreciated in the days to come. "I'd like you to be that person too," I said, standing on tiptoe and kissing his cheek. "Thank you, Elliot." We looked at each other for a moment, and then he pulled his helmet on and started the bike.
"I'll see you soon," he said, his voice muffled, "and don't worry about looking after Bill. Between you, you'll be just fine."
I finished hanging out the washing, told myself I was fortunate to have Elliot as a friend, and that I must set my lustful feelings for him to one side. He was right. A new relationship would be an added complication neither of us needed right now. With a resigned sigh, I went back inside to check on Grandad. "And what are you up to now?" I tutted, when I found him with the bed covers pushed back and his feet resting on the floor.
"Has Elliot gone?" he asked.
"Yes," I said. "The knight in shining armour has mounted his trusty metal steed and gone to rescue someone else. You didn't tell him off for not letting on about me, did you?" I asked, just to make sure.
"No," he said. "He's a good lad, and I know he had my best interests at heart. He always does. And besides, I dare say his mother had more to do with you staying on here than anyone else, didn't she?"
Nothing escaped this man's notice. "Never mind that now," I said, not wanting to dob Louise in. "What exactly are you planning to do?"
"I just want to have a stretch," he said. "I've been in this blasted bed too damn long."
"But I don't know what to do," I said, feeling nervous.
"Do?" he chuckled. "You haven't got to do anything, other than make sure I don't end up on my backside."
I had to laugh at that. "Here," I said, stepping forward, "let me just help you up." We took a couple of very slow turns around the room, as much for my confidence as Grandad's benefit, and then went into the kitchen.
"You've been tidying up," he said,
noticing the less cluttered dresser and the fresh flowers in jars along the windowsill. "I hope that's all right. I'm not very good at twiddling my thumbs, and I wanted to make myself useful." I didn't mention my list-making.
"Well, you've certainly done that."
He smiled approvingly.
"It all looks lovely. The place has missed having a woman's touch. Not," he added with a wink, "that we're supposed to say such things in these enlightened times."
I thought I'd let him get away with it just this once.
"Do you know," he yawned, "that's me done. It's been quite a morning, hasn't it?"
"It certainly has," I agreed. I was pretty tired out myself.
"Do you think it would be all right if I had an early nap?"
"I think it would be fine," I told him. "Let's get you back into bed." I had hoped that once Elliot had been to help whoever Vicky had drafted him in to take care of, he would come back and take over with Grandad again. But there was no Ducati rumble either nearby or in the distance, and that was a shame because there was something specific I wanted to do that went beyond doling out pills and straightening sheets. Something that I hoped we would be able to do for Grandad together. Steeling myself to be brave and think positive, even though I was flying solo, I mentioned it to Grandad. "I have a feeling Elliot isn't going to make it back today, and I don't know how we'll manage it between us," I told him, "but we're going to try and get you up those stairs and into your own bed tonight." There, I'd said it.
"There should be a set of instructions from the hospital physio about here somewhere," Grandad immediately said. "She printed them out to remind me how to go up and down stairs and steps safely."
The fact that he hadn't said he'd manage another night in the single bed was proof enough that he really did want to be back in his own space, and I resolved to do whatever was needed to make that happen.
End of CD 3. CD 4.
Your paperwork from the hospital is in a file in the kitchen, I told him, remembering seeing Elliot look through it. I'll get it out and then we can read the instructions together and, I added, as you'll be sleeping in there tonight, would you mind if I went into your room and gave it an airing?
Of course not, he smiled. There are already clean sheets on the bed, but some more fresh air would be most welcome.
You can't beat it, can you? I smiled back. I've always got the windows open. Mum moans about it all the time in the winter.
She was the same when she was growing up,
Grandad told me, thankfully not noticing the tears I tried to blink away as I realised not only what I'd said, but that I'd been struck by the realisation that Mum would never feel the cold again.
Always moaning about being cold, right from autumn through to spring.
His words tailed off, and then he added,
You can air her room too if you like. Have you looked in it yet?
No, I said, fussing with the cushion on the chair to avoid looking at him. I've only been in the spare room and the bathroom.
Well,
he said, his gaze returning to the window.
Now we've finally established who you are, feel free to have a proper look about the place, won't you?
Thank you, I said, pulling myself together and trying not to think how heartbreaking it was going to be to tell him what had happened to Mum. I will. I didn't mention that I'd looked over the farm and in the barn already, and I didn't say that I'd leave exploring Mum's room for a bit longer either. I had no idea what I would find in there, but I certainly wasn't ready to face it yet. There is one thing I want to see, I said, rushing back to the kitchen and drying my eyes before returning with some scissors and a jar filled with water. I leant out of the open window and gasped at the sight of the roses which scaled the height of the house and were in full bloom. They were a riot of colour, and the scent, intensified by the strengthening sunshine, was intoxicating. Wow, I gasped. The jars in the kitchen were full of flowers cut from the front of the house, and they were lovely, but I knew another one filled with roses would look and smell even better.
You like those, do you? Grandad laughed.
Just a bit. Did you plant them?
No, he said, not me. They were Felicity's passion. The whole garden was, not that there's much of it left. Whenever one of her roses has died off, though, I've always replaced it like for like. It's been my way of keeping her floral legacy alive.
I began to realise that every conversation we were destined to share was going to have an emotional undercurrent running through it. There was so much for me to learn and catch up on, not least Grandad's explanation of the circumstances surrounding Mum's departure. Can I cut some of the roses? I asked, again pushing the thought of the revelatory moments away. For you to have in here?
Of course, Grandad keenly agreed. And we can take them upstairs tonight.
Once I'd filled the jar with the yellow, red, pink and peach scented roses and embellished it further with lime green Alchemilla mollis, I turned my attention to Grandad's bedroom. The decor was dated, with lots of 80s pine furniture and floral sprigged Laura Ashley-style prints, but I had expected that because it was similar to the spare room. But what I wasn't prepared for were the shelves full of framed photographs. "Mum," I murmured, picking up one of her in her late teens. There were 18 photos in total, one for each year of Mum's life before she left, I guessed. I lightly ran my fingers over the frame of the last one, wondering if she might have been pregnant with me when it was taken. The last 3 or 4 were classic moody teenage shots. She looked a bit begrudging to be facing the camera, unlike in the early ones where she was all smiles. What had changed? What was it that had turned her off the farm and indeed away from her father? "Hello," called a voice up the stairs, making me jump. "Are you there, Felicity?" It was Louise. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I'm here." As I reached the bottom of the stairs, she pulled me in for a hug. "Have you seen Elliot?" I asked, blinking away the tears her kind gesture prompted when she finally let me go. "I haven't seen him," she said, offering me a tissue. "But he called to tell me that Bill had sussed out who you are and he wanted me to ring and check everything was okay. He's not going to be able to get back himself, so I decided to pop in person." "That was kind of him," I said, "and you." "I'm not sure if he really is all that busy," Louise admitted, biting her lip.
or if he wanted to give you and Bill some space.
Kinder still, but then I wouldn't have expected anything less of Elliot.
So,
said Louise, studying my face.
How's it going?
I didn't get the chance to tell her that Grandad and I were getting along wonderfully, but that I still hadn't found the moment or mustered the courage to tell him about Mum.
Are you two going to be out there whispering all day? Grandad shouted from the dining room. Come in here. I want to talk to you.
Sorry, Bill, said Louise. We're on our way.
What I'd really like to know,
Grandad said to me once we and the cat were settled with tea and a slice of delicious shop-bought cake which Louise had arrived with,
is why you've decided to come and find me now. Why didn't you come before?
This was it then. This was the moment everything was going to be revealed. I was grateful for both Louise's kind and encouraging smile and the boost my blood sugar was receiving courtesy of the sweet slice of sponge. I pressed my hand against the pocket where Mum's letters and Nonna's recipe still rested, protecting my heart as best they could. Because, I began, I didn't know about you before. I only found out about you and the farm very recently. Grandad nodded.
Your mother didn't talk to you about me or this place or her mother while you were growing up then?
No, I huskily said. I'm afraid not. If she had, I most likely would have come a long time ago. I couldn't promise that, though, because when I'd first read Mum's letter, I'd been adamant that I wouldn't come. But then it hadn't taken me long to change my mind, had it?
So, where has she ended up then? Grandad asked. With your father?
I noticed Louise shift in her seat. Clearly Grandad had known more than she thought. No, I swallowed. Mum didn't find him. He'd given her a false Italian address when they parted after their holiday, so that turned out to be impossible.
And yet she still chose not to come home when she realised that, he said. She preferred to make her life and yours elsewhere.
He sounded incredibly sad and my heart broke for him.
I'm ashamed to say, I was furious when I found out she was pregnant. He carried on. I should have taken time to get used to the idea before I spoke to her about it, but I was so upset and scared. I'd struggled to cope with her wayward behaviour after Felicity died. I knew I'd let her get away with too much.
You can't blame yourself for her behaviour, Bill, said Louise. She was a law unto herself, and I had no idea that you knew she was pregnant when she left.
Loving fathers don't miss much, he sniffed. I also knew that you knew too, Louise, but I appreciated that we never talked about it. It would have made it all so much harder if we had.
That's very generous of you, said Louise, looking misty-eyed.
No point holding a grudge, he shrugged. And, like I said, our silence did make things a little easier.
Mum did settle in Italy, I said, wanting him to know that she had made something of her life. Well, she had a base there, on a farm which belongs to the Rossi family. For the most part, it was where I grew up. They mainly grow cherries and olives.
She settled on a farm?
Grandad gasped, his eyes wide.
Well, I never. She always despised this place because it stopped us taking summer holidays and meant working long hours. And yet she willingly settled on someone else's when it would have been just the same.
I looked at Louise and bit my lip. Rather than make things better, I was just making them worse, and the hardest part was still to come.
You're forgetting how much she hated the British weather, said Louise, trying to lighten the moment. But it didn't help.
She didn't stay there all the time, I rushed on, keen to make amends. As I said, it was more of a base. More often than not, she was off travelling. It was her ambition to visit every country in the world. I used to go with her when I was younger, but then I began to work properly for the Rossis.
Fliss, said Grandad,
putting up a hand to stop me.
Can I just ask you something?
Of course, I swallowed. I looked at Louise again. Her head was bowed and I realised I must have made another mistake.
You just said this farm in Italy was a base for Jennifer, and that it was her ambition to visit every country.
That's right, I nodded.
Why isn't it now?
For the second time since I'd arrived, the world ground to a halt. Without realising, I'd been talking about Mum in the past tense. Because she's dead, Bill, said Louise, reaching for my hand and saving me from having to say the words. She's not with us anymore.
Is this true?
Grandad asked, looking to me.
Yes,
I nodded, my voice barely audible.
it is. She died of cancer a few weeks ago, and she left me a letter telling me the name of this place and where it was, and that she wanted me to come and find you.
A sob escaped Grandad's lips, and I pulled my hand from Louise's grasp and rushed to his bedside.
My girl is gone,
he choked.
Yes,
I said again.
She's gone, I'm so sorry.
I don't know how long we sat, our hands tightly clasped together, but the sun had long since left the room by the time Grandad spoke again. Like mine and Louise's, his tears had flowed freely the whole time we were quiet, and it was a relief to witness it. The last thing he needed to do was bottle his grief up. He didn't strike me as the type to display his emotions. He was a proper old country boy, and even though it was tough to see his stiff upper lip disappear, it was a godsend too.
I searched for her, you know,
he eventually said, his voice raspy.
And I never gave up hope that one day she'd come back. I hate the thought of her still hating me all the way to her grave.
I don't think she did, Grandad,
I said, pulling out and handing him Mum's letter.
She left this for you.
If it's anything like mine, it will hopefully explain a few things. He took it from me, and I passed him the glasses on the little table next to his bed. It was too late for Mum to change anything inside the envelope now, but I hoped her letter answered Grandad's questions and gave him some of the peace and acceptance he so sorely needed.
Another letter, he swallowed. I hope it says more than the note she left when she disappeared.
We'll leave you to read it, Bill, said Louise, standing up. Come on, Fliss, love, she added, holding out her hand.
Before you go,
said Grandad, just as we reached the door,
tell me, Fliss, are you in a rush to get back to this farm in Italy?
That depends,
I told him.
On what?
On whether or not you'd like me to stay here for a while.
I'd very much like you to stay,
he said, without a moment's hesitation,
and for much longer than a while, if you'd like to.
I'd like that very much,
I said, crossing the room again and giving him another hug. I know I'd promised Marco that I'd be back in time to work over the summer season, but that wasn't going to happen now, and I hoped he wouldn't mind. I knew Nonna and Alessandro would be thrilled, so hopefully they'd be able to talk him round.
Good,
Grandad sniffed as he patted my back.
I'm pleased about that, because from what I've heard you saying to Elliot, there's plenty here to keep you occupied if you think you're up to it.
Oh, I am,
I told him, kissing his damp, whiskery cheek. I'm more than up to it.
Fancy yourself as a bit of a fruit farmer, do you?
He smiled through his tears.
I do have a certain amount of experience in the field,
I smiled back.
In that case,
he said with a wobbly smile,
I think both Fenview Farm and I are in very safe hands.
Chapter 9. A downturn in the weather put the brakes on me starting any work on the farm for the next few days. Not that I had ever been a fair weather worker, but according to the forecast, it was going to be reasonably short-lived and wouldn't hamper me for too long. And therefore, I took the opportunity to sort a few things in the house and spend some quality time with Grandad instead. We had soon got the measure of the stairs, and having safely made the first ascent, we were, if not quite zipping up and down, then gathering pace. Grandad hadn't shared the details of what Mum had put in her letter, and obviously I wasn't going to ask, but he seemed soothed by it, and even though we both shed more tears after he had read it, they weren't as intense as those that had previously fallen. Before I'd experienced it for myself, I had no idea that grief was so draining and all-consuming, but I was beginning to understand what Louise had meant when she had told me it becomes a part of you. The pain of losing Mum was still prevalent, still very much in evidence, but the ache had dulled a little. Grandad and I didn't go in for heart-to-heart conversations, but rather quietly felt our way, often focusing on the comfort of domestic tasks, eating the delicious Italian dishes I had already prepared, and always with the windows thrown open. The gentle pitter-patter of rain which formed the backdrop to the next few days was like a soothing ASMR soundtrack, and I was comforted by it as I settled into the house. The only thing missing was Elliot, but he had telephoned, in lieu of not making it back to the farm, thanks to the continuing staff shortage, which he assured me was genuine in spite of what Louise had said. He promised he would visit again soon, and was happy that Grandad was in safe hands, even if he wasn't feeling quite so content about other things.
"I feel as though I'm failing you, Fliss,"
was the first thing he said when Grandad handed the phone over one day.
"I told you I'd be there for you and Bill, and now I'm not."
"It's fine," I told him, and I meant it. I think it's good for Grandad and I to have this time to ourselves, to readjust, and now we've decided that I'm going to be here for a while, there's going to be plenty of time for you to be my friend in the weeks to come. He brightened at that, and I found myself again wishing that we could be more than friends. That pesky spark refused to remain extinguished, and I was constantly on the lookout for further distraction to stop it catching my eye.
"You know what?"
Grandad said, after a few nights back in his own bed.
"I feel like a new man. It's been weeks since I had such a good sleep. I know it's going to take me a while to get to grips with what's happened to my Jennifer, but at least now I know, don't I? There's no more wondering and wishing."
"That's very true," I agreed.
"And there was comfort in that letter she wrote,"
he sniffed, confirming my thoughts.
"I thought she'd gone through life hating me, but she hadn't at all."
I couldn't help wishing that Mum had had the sense to tell him that years ago, but there was no point in feeling bitter. It wouldn't change the past, and we needed to focus on the future. It was reassuring to know that Grandad could move forward with his life with the blanks now filled in. It must have been so difficult to cope and carry on with that great big gap always nagging away in the background. "I'm so pleased it's helped," I said, looking at him properly and feeling relieved that I had decided to come to Fenview Farm rather than pretend I'd never read any of what Mum had written to me. He looked so much better for the combination of reading Mum's final words and the undisturbed rest. Nothing like the dazed and confused old man I had upset just a few days before, and I was feeling happier too. I had enjoyed putting the dining room back in order and getting to know the house. Although, that said, the brief peek I had taken into Mum's old room had come as a shock. I hadn't gone right inside, but I hadn't needed to see that the place was a shrine. From the arrangement on the dressing table to the posters on the walls, I knew it was exactly as Mum had left it, and a lump had formed in my throat as I thought of Grandad carefully tending and dusting, perhaps dreaming of her return to the fold. I knew we would need to talk about what to do with it at some point, but not yet.
"The forecast looks set to improve by the weekend," Grandad said as I cleared our lunch dishes away.
I had been thrilled when he told me he was very much enjoying having his menu expanded, and he certainly always looked replete. He had eagerly finished up every dish I had served as a result of my spree in the Winbridge deli. I'd cooked spaghetti with rich tomato sauce that day, and he'd mopped up every trace with a crust of garlic-enhanced bread. "Thank goodness for that," I said, peering out the door. "I'm getting desperate to know the outside of Fenview Farm as well as the inside." Grandad looked pleased.
"Good," he smiled. "Our little patch of the fens needs you, Fliss. And you do like it, don't you?"
I was touched that he had referred to the spot as ours, and I could feel those tender roots I'd imagined before pushing their way further down. "I'm completely smitten," I told him, "but to tell you the truth, I'm still struggling to come to terms with Mum leaving this place behind. It's absolutely idyllic in my eyes." Grandad was quiet for a moment,
and I hoped I hadn't upset him. I didn't want to have to spend my time here not talking about Mum. She had been as real to me as she had been to Grandad, and even though our relationships with her had been very different, I felt it was important to keep her memory alive.
Yes, well, he sighed. You and your mum see things differently, don't you? And the pair of you are very different.
That's true. I nodded. For a start, there was Mum's flighty spirit, which was the polar opposite to my stay-at-home one. We never really were peas in a pod. Grandad readily agreed with that.
So tell me then, Fliss, he further said, what exactly have you got planned to get done around here when this rain finally stops falling?
I made us tea and we pored over the list I had made. I was a bit nervous about Grandad reading it. It felt like he was a prospective employer scanning my job application. What I'd written would demonstrate whether or not I knew my stuff and was up to taking on the role of caretaker of Fenview Farm. I hoped I passed the test.
Looks to me like you've got everything covered,
he eventually said, and I felt relieved.
I've been meaning to wash and straighten the sign on the road and fix the cages since the end of last year, but what with the old trick hip, I didn't dare venture up the ladder.
I was surprised Elliot hadn't stepped in and sorted the sign at least, but then he was always busy, and I could tell Grandad was a proud man, and as such, asking for help wouldn't have come naturally, even if he was surrounded by people who were willing. I would be out there now if it wasn't so wet underfoot, I said, looking out of the window, and Grandad nodded. When the harvest is over, I carried on, replacing all of the nets will be a priority. It wouldn't hurt to leave the cages bare for a while either, so the birds can clear up anything that's left.
It's certainly been a while since they were done, Grandad mused, and you're right, the soil could do with a good clearing and cleansing. We used to have a few chickens who were willing to help with that.
Perhaps you should think about getting some again, I suggested.
I might, he smiled, if you were willing to help look after them.
His comment seemed to me a way of finding out if I was planning on staying beyond the harvest without having to actually ask the question. I thought about my role with the Rossies, how I was accepted there and how I fitted in, and then my thoughts shifted and I realised that I now had the chance to create something as family-orientated for myself. I had always felt a part of the farm in Puglia, but at Fenview Farm my ties were that much stronger because they were bound by blood. It would be a wrench to leave my Italian home for good, but hadn't I felt, when I left for Winbridge, that I might be going back there in a different guise and under changed circumstances? I haven't got much experience with poultry, I therefore said to Grandad, feeling my attachment to the place and to him deepen, but I'm always willing to learn.
Explain to me what else you've got in mind to get on with then,
he grinned, giving me a nudge. Clearly my answer was the one he wanted to hear, and I knew I would soon have to break the news to Marco that I wouldn't be back to organise the season after all. The strawberries, I said, tapping the paper and elaborating on the words I'd written. They're the priority. I'm worried they haven't got the straw on yet. They're going to need it soon if they aren't going to spoil, especially after all this rain. Ideally, it should have been down before the downturn in the weather.
I'll give my friend Jake a ring, said Grandad. He owns Skylark Farm, and that's where the straw will come from. He helps sell the strawberries, and he keeps a few hens too. He might even have a couple going spare, and if we could patch up the old hen house, that would save us some money.
Sounds good to me.
So,
said Grandad, once we had finished going through the list and adding a few more jobs to it.
How come you know so much about fruit farming? I know it's in your blood, but that doesn't account for your obvious knowledge and understanding. Your mother never showed much interest here, so you haven't picked it up from her.
She had skills, though, I told him. She used to work on farms to fund her travels.
They were just a means to an end, though, weren't they? He sighed. Somewhere to tide her over, not somewhere to properly settle.
There was nowhere on earth capable of making her do that, I truthfully told him.
And don't I know it?
He tutted, before making us more tea while I gave him a potted history of my love affair with fruit farming. Obviously it began for me with the cherry and olive harvest in Puglia,
but my love for British fruit farming came from the pick-your-own places where Mum and I used to work when we were roaming about a bit. Grandad didn't look all that impressed with the idea of me missing out on my education, even if it was to pick fruit. There were a couple that we worked at fairly regularly, I carried on, and I learned loads at those. Mum was happy just to do what was asked, but I used to trail around after the managers, asking questions and picking things up. Grandad's disapproval quickly changed to pride.
"You'll get far in life with an inquiring mind," he told me.
Well, I said, I loved learning how it all worked, and I was never happier than when I was sunburnt or filthy or both and stuffed full of fresh fruit. Grandad laughed, his gaze drifting off as he pictured how I must have looked. What I remember most, I carried on, is the taste of those first strawberries of the year, plucked fresh from the plant and greedily eaten before they made their way anywhere near the punnets I was supposed to be filling for the farm shop. They were so sweet and delicious, and I always ate my fill before the end of the day.
"There's nothing quite like fruit eaten straight from the plant, is there?" said Grandad. "How anyone can enjoy stuff out of season that's been refrigerated and travelled halfway across the globe is beyond me."
I know, I keenly agreed, but that's the way of the world now, isn't it? We expect to have access to anything and everything whenever we want it.
"Yes," he nodded. "You're right. Did you do anything else on these farms, besides eat the profits and ask questions?"
Oh, yes, I said. I often helped with the orders and admin and things. As soon as I was old enough, I was helping to run one of them throughout the summer, so the owner could take some holiday, and I loved it.
"What did your mum make of that?"
Oh, she wasn't with me by then. She'd found somewhere else to work by that point, but I went back for a few years before deciding to stay put in Puglia.
"What prompted you to stay?"
It was Mum, actually. She loved working on different farms, but she also enjoyed immersing herself in the life and culture of the places she visited. And we decided to set something up at the Rossies, which would give travellers the opportunity to stop for a few weeks and have a similar experience.
"Like a working holiday, you mean?"
Yes, I said, exactly that. The visitors work all day, then we eat together, and in the evenings and at weekends, I take them on organised trips to the less well-known sites in the area.
"It sounds busy."
It is from May to December. The winter is very quiet, and cold too.
"I'm not sure Fenview Farm can compete with all that," Grandad sighed. "There aren't many sights to see around here."
Oh, yes, it can, I said, reaching for his hand and giving it a squeeze. This place can definitely compete. It's got you for a start. Grandad laughed.
"And that's a good thing, is it?"
It sure is. We were quiet for a moment, each lost in our own thoughts.
"So, if you're going to be staying here," Grandad then asked, "who will be doing your job in Puglia?"
That's probably going to fall to Marco, the farm owner's grandson, I explained. I'm not sure how he's going to feel about that, but I hope he'll cope. He lives with his nonna, who owns the farm, and his dad, Nonna's son Alessandro.
They keep it in the family over there, then?
Very much so, and they always made me and Mum feel like family too. Grandad nodded. Mum never spoke ill of you to them, Grandad. I want you to know that.
She never spoke of me at all, did she?
I couldn't deny that. You know, I said, squeezing his hand again, they lost someone close to them too. Alessandro's wife died when Marco was just a boy. You should get to know them. I'm certain you'd get on well, and they could tell you loads about Mum.
But I can't speak Italian.
He ruefully smiled. That's as maybe, but they can all speak English.
Well, he said, I'll think about it.
I don't know why I hadn't thought of it sooner. It would be wonderful to connect my two families. I don't suppose you have Wi-Fi here, do you, Grandad?
Why, what?
He frowned. An internet connection.
No, he said, I've never seen the point, although Elliot has mentioned it.
Not to worry, I said, forcing myself not to linger over thoughts of our absent friend. I'll try the local library and see if I can send an email from there to Puglia explaining everything. Does Winbridge have one?
Yes, said Grandad. A very good one, but you'll need something with the farm as your address on it if you want to register.
Of course, I said, biting my lip. I hadn't thought of that.
Leave it with me, Grandad smiled. I know the library manager. I'll see if she can help you at least access a computer to tide you over.
Thank you, I said. That would be a big help.
The lack of phone signal at the farm made messaging difficult enough, so sending emails and making video calls would be impossible, and I didn't want to say I wouldn't be going back in a text. A lengthier explanation was definitely required.
I have to say, Grandad then said, it is a comfort to think that your mother did pick up something of the farming bug while she was living here. Not that she ever let me or her mother know it, of course.
Was she really not a fan of this place?
Goodness me, no,
he vehemently said.
By the time she hit her teens, she was a right sulky madam. She used to open her window to shout or march downstairs to tell us how much she hated the farm because it stopped us taking holidays like all her friends. She said she couldn't wait to get away from this place, and then she'd flounce off again or slam the window shut. I was grateful we didn't have near neighbours.
She sounds like hard work.
Oh, she was, but teenagers mostly are, aren't they?
Thinking back, I knew I'd had my moments, and Marco certainly had. There were a few months when he and Alessandro had done nothing but argue. I supposed he would have been about the age Mum was when she left the farm. It was awful to think of her leaving in a temper and never finding the courage or the ability to swallow her pride and come back. I wondered if her decision had impacted on her life, and now I'd never know. It was yet another of those questions that would forever be unanswered.
Your grandmother and I could appreciate we were a bit off the beaten track here, Grandad continued, so we always offered to run her into town if she wanted to get a Saturday job, but Windbridge wasn't good enough for her either, she said. She had her sights set on bigger places with more thrilling opportunities.
She always had.
I suppose that's why I can't imagine her here, I quietly said.
What do you mean?
Ever since I arrived, I explained, I've been trying to picture her here. First, I tried to imagine her at the market in Windbridge, and then sitting here at the table, but I haven't been able to conjure up anything. I just can't see her here at all.
I'm not surprised, said Grandad.
There was no malice in his tone, more resignation.
She was never the right fit for this place, and she went to great lengths to make sure everyone knew it.
I wondered if those words had been flung about in an argument. It was ironic that Mum had chosen them when she had written about me being a better fit for the farm than she had been. Or was that more than a coincidence?
And what about me? I asked. Do I fit?
Oh, yes, said Grandad. You fit Fenview Farm like a Savile Row suit, my love.
Chapter 10. Having explained my fruit farming experience and listened to Grandad describe me as the perfect fit for Fenview Farm, I felt lighter and brighter than I had in ages, and I was now entirely convinced that following Mum's instructions and turning up in Windbridge had been the right thing to do. My life was set to change, and even though I still mourned her loss, I was grateful that she had gifted me this new opportunity. I couldn't wait to make a start on all the work that needed doing, and when the rain finally stopped, I was raring to go. However, a quick look through the storage sheds put paid to my plans, and I inwardly cursed that I hadn't prioritised a stocktake as a wet weather essential. I can't find anything to repair the cages with, I told Grandad, and the henhouse roof needs recovering, but there's nothing for that either. Grandad looked up from the local newspaper he was reading, a frown etched across his forehead.
I hadn't realised things had run so low,
he said, looking concerned.
I was sure I had an end of a roll of roofing felt kicking about here somewhere.
There is a bit, I conceded, but only enough to patch it. Ideally, the whole lot needs to come off and be redone, otherwise you're just throwing good money after bad. Grandad's frown cleared and he smiled.
You like to do things properly, don't you, Fliss?
Of course, I seriously said. If you don't do a job properly in the first place, you just end up doing it twice. Our conversation was interrupted by a strange honking on the drive, which sent the cat, who had snuck in after me, scrabbling back outside. "What on earth's that?" I asked.
"That'll be Beck," Grandad grinned. "Well, that car of hers anyway. It has the oddest horn."
"That car has the oddest everything," I giggled, peering out as she pulled onto the drive. It was a bit early in the day for a social call, but as it turned out, it wasn't one. "I'm just off to work," Beck told me after I'd greeted her, "and wondered if you needed anything picking up in town." "We're running low on milk and bread," I said, thinking of the depleted larder and fridge, as well as all the other things I now needed for the farm repairs. "And quite a lot of other stuff, actually," I added, biting my lip. "Do you want to make a list?" she asked, checking her watch, "and I'll go and buy it all on my break and drop it off on my way home." "You are a love," I told her. "I don't suppose there's any chance you'd take me with you instead, is there? I can get a taxi back easily enough. If Grandad doesn't mind being left on his own for a bit, that is," I hastily added.
"Grandad would love to be left on his own for a bit," he said. "No offence, but it's been a while since I had the place to myself. I promise I won't go doing anything I shouldn't."
With that settled, I swapped the work boots I had borrowed from him for my own strappy sandals, grabbed my bag and jobs list, and jumped in the passenger seat of the Banana-mobile. There was no time to get changed, so my messy bun, checked shirt and denim cut-offs would have to do. The outfit was a bit Daisy Duke, but the shorts weren't that short, so I thought I'd get away with it. "You sure you'll be all right?" I called to Grandad as Beck swung the car back round to face the road.
"I'll be fine,"
he said, waving us off. I had to admit he did look rather happy at the prospect of some time alone. Privacy had no doubt been hard to come by since he'd been in hospital, and now, with the added shock of what had happened to Mum to come to terms with, I didn't think a little solitude would do him any harm at all. I had tried to keep out of the way a bit, but it wasn't the same as being completely alone. I let out a long breath and watched the wind-swept verge whiz by. "He'll be all right," said Beck, sounding stoic. "Now tell me more of what's on your list, and I'll drop you off closest to where you need to be." I quickly ran through everything, and Beck suggested that Anderson's, the timber yard, and agricultural suppliers would be a good place to start. They opened early, and if the order was big enough, they'd deliver it straight to the farm. That was a blessing, as I didn't fancy carrying a roll of roofing felt around town. "And before you do your grocery shop," Beck said, after she'd given me a few directions, "come and find me in the Cherry Tree Cafe, and I'll treat you to a slice of cake. It's on the square, so you won't miss it." I was almost certain I'd seen it already. It had to be the pretty place I'd spotted the day I arrived. "I take it that's where you're working?" I asked her. "Yes," she said. "I'm doing a bit of waitressing and helping out with some of the crafting sessions one of the co-owners organises. It's just until the Royal Academy accepts one of my paintings, of course," she added with a mischievous smile. "Then I'll be able to permanently swap cupcakes for canvases." She stopped to let me out and gave another blast on the goose-like horn as I pulled open the door to Anderson's and stepped inside. Wandering around an agricultural supply store might not have been everyone's cup of tea, but I thoroughly enjoyed the time I spent seeking out all the things I needed for the farm, plus a couple of extra bits that caught my eye. I negotiated a price for the end of a roll of roofing felt, which had more than enough left on it for what I needed, and then gave the address for where I wanted everything delivered.
"Fenview Farm on Ladies' Drove?" questioned the elderly employee who had rung everything up on the till, his bushy grey eyebrows raised.
"That's right," I nodded.
"What, where Bill Brown lives?" asked his younger colleague.
"That's the place," I reiterated, rifling through my bag for my purse.
"I'm not sure his account is up to date," said the chap at the till.
He looked embarrassed, and I wondered if Grandad had a hefty bill to settle. I didn't ask, just in case. Thankfully, I could easily run to paying for the things I'd ordered. "I don't want to put anything on account," I smiled. "I'll pay for my order, and I'm guessing free delivery is all part of the wonderful Anderson service I've been hearing so much about, isn't it?"
"As you're paying today, and the farm is only just out of our free drop-off zone, then that'll be fine," said the younger man, sounding relieved. "We can have it with you first thing Monday morning, if that suits."
That's perfect, I told them. Thank you very much. I could tell they were gearing up to ask what my connection to the farm was, and headed off before they had the chance. The walk into town led me near the library, and as it was open, I ducked inside, keen to find out exactly what ID and paperwork I would need to sign up.
You wouldn't happen to be Bill Brown's granddaughter, would you? Asked the woman on the desk when I inquired.
Yes, I frowned. I am. How did you know that?
He phoned earlier. She smiled. He said you might pop in and that even though you couldn't register with us yet, you'd appreciate access to a computer for a few minutes. Is that right?
It is, I said. Is that going to be possible?
If I override the system. She winked. I wouldn't usually, but as you're a relative of Bill's, I'll make an exception.
I thanked her profusely, then composed a lengthy email to the Rossi clan, explaining more about what had happened since my arrival, what Grandad was like, what the farm was like, and finally, and with my breath held, that I wouldn't be back in Puglia for quite some time. It made no sense to hold my breath. We weren't having a conversation and I wasn't going to see his reaction, but I had the image of Marco in my head from the day I had left, urging me to go back practically on the return flight. I hoped he would understand my decision to want to get to know Fenview Farm and Grandad better. I knew Nonna and Alessandro would, so if he was upset, they'd hopefully be able to appease him. I was relying on them to pave the way for me to break the news that I might well want to stay in the Fens forever. With the explanation reread and finally sent, and my heart rate steadying after the surprise of acknowledging the possibility of staying at the farm for good, I thanked the librarian again and carried on into the town centre. My stomach growled as soon as I caught sight of the Cherry Tree Cafe, and I hoped the place had a good selection of cakes.
How did you find Anderson's?
Beck asked almost before I was through the door. It was great, I said, as my gaze swivelled around to take in the pastel spring-themed interior, and my nose picked up the sweet scent of warm pastries and hot coffee. Wow, I grinned. This place is divine.
Wait until you taste one of Gemma's cakes, said Beck. Then you really will be in seventh heaven. Did you get everything you needed?
Yes, I said, still looking about me. And they're going to deliver it all free of charge, which is a bonus.
You must have charmed them with those long-tanned legs of yours, she said, giving me a nudge.
It wasn't my legs, I whispered. They were so shocked when I gave them the farm address that I took advantage of the moment and kind of railroaded them into it.
Did you tell them who you are?
She asked, steering me to an empty seat and handing me a menu. No, I said, I don't want to announce myself until I've had a chance to talk it all through with Grandad and we've decided what we're going to say. With what's happened to Mum, it isn't going to be easy for him, so I'll be guided by what he wants. Even though he'd told his friend at the library about me, I still wanted to talk to him before I started saying anything.
Right, said Beck. Of course.
I couldn't help noticing she'd turned a little pink.
So,
she said, flicking open her order pad and pulling my thoughts back to my rumbling tum,
what can I get you?
I eventually settled on a trio of fruit and cream cheese breakfast pastries and strong coffee to accompany them. They were absolutely delicious. The pastry was crisp, the cheese was soft, and the tang of the fruit cut through the sweetness, creating the perfect balance.
What did you think?
Asked the woman who cleared my empty plate, poured me more coffee, and introduced herself as Gemma, the cafe owner.
Scrumptious, I told her.
Delicious. She flushed with pride.
They're a new addition, she explained, and they're going down a storm.
I'm not surprised.
The only thing I'm not happy about is the fruit,
she quietly said. I'm trying to buy local, but the commercial farms all supply in such large quantities, they won't take small orders. She sat down in the chair opposite mine, and her smile grew. I don't suppose you'd be able to help me out with that, would you? Beck mentioned that you've just moved to Fenview Farm. You're Bill's granddaughter, aren't you? I looked across to where Beck was standing. She looked even pinker than before, and I guessed she'd let the cat out of the bag. She looked so upset that it felt impossible to be cross with her, especially as she might have found the farm some new business. To tell you the truth, Gemma continued,
I wasn't sure the farm was still trading, but Chris Dempster, who sells fruit and veg on the market, has told me it's still operational and that last year he and Jake at Skylark Farm took most of the crops to sell on your granddad's behalf. It certainly is still operational, and we grow a whole range of fruit, I told her. We've got apples, pears, plums, a few cherries, strawberries, and a good range of other soft fruit. That sounds perfect, she said, her eyes sparkling. Just what I was hoping. I want to supply seasonal and local in here, and I'm looking to forge permanent links with a reputable, small-scale grower. I'm willing to adapt the menu to whatever's available, and if that's only for a short while, then that's fine too, because it will make it even more special. But what about things like the pastries I've just had? I asked. Won't you want to sell those all year round? Well, yes, she said, but I have enough freezer capacity to make that possible. She certainly sounded like she'd got it all worked out, and it was obvious her business was thriving. In the time I'd been sitting there, the place had filled to capacity, as had the tables outside. So, what do you think? She asked, her voice full of hope. Do you think we could strike a deal where Fenview Farm supplies the Cherry Tree Cafe fruit? It sounds like a winning combination to me. It sounded like a winning combination to me too. I was excited at the prospect of working with this clever and clearly competent businesswoman. I'll have to talk to my grandfather, I told her, reining my feelings in and erring on the side of caution. It wasn't my place to sign the harvest away, even though I was tempted to. Just to be certain he hasn't got contracts lined up elsewhere, but I'm sure we could come to some arrangement. Fantastic, she smiled, as a woman with red curls came bouncing over the cafe threshold and set the bell above the door jangling wildly. And there's no real rush. As long as I can get my hands on some fresh local strawberries, I'll be happy. They must be well on their way to ripening now. I smiled back, my heart skipping at the thought of what this opportunity could do for Fenview. If we could form a lasting collaboration with the cafe, then it could make a big difference to the farm and really raise its profile. Sorry I've taken so long, said the curly-haired woman who was dressed in a pretty floral tea dress which clashed gloriously with her hair. I'm having a total mare this morning. This is Lizzie, Gemma said to me, my business partner, and she isn't usually so flustered. Whatever's the matter? She asked, turning to her friend. Lizzie stood with her hands on her hips and explained. Her other half, Ben, had booked a table at a restaurant they had been trying to get into for months, but the local taxi firm had let them down, and they'd had to cancel because they had no transport. Their own car was in the garage awaiting repairs, so they couldn't get there under their own steam. You didn't need to do that, said Gemma. Tom would have driven you. But you've got that event at school tonight, said Lizzie, so that wouldn't have worked. What about your dad? It's too late now, and besides, we wouldn't have wanted to eat knowing we were on a timer because he was waiting to ferry us home. I suppose not, said Gemma. What we need, Lizzie pouted, is somewhere nice to eat around here in the evenings. The pub and other places are all well and good, but I want something a bit different every now and again, something unique. Well, said Gemma, standing up, I'm not opening in the evenings. It's all I can do to drag myself home at the end of the day. I wasn't meaning here, said Lizzie. It would be nice to occasionally get out of town, wouldn't it? But not so far that it's a hassle to get back again. Having promised to talk to Grandad about the harvest, I left them dreaming about exclusive evening eateries. Gemma had refused to let me pay for either the pastries or the coffee. Consider it an incentive, she had winked, a little sweetener. I thanked her, and feeling comfortably full, headed to the supermarket to stock up on essentials and to the market for everything else. Just as had happened the weekend before, I was soon weighed down with bags and couldn't help wishing I had transport of my own. There was no sign of the taxi in the designated bay, and even though Beck had generously offered to run me home when she finished her shift, I didn't really want to have to wait that long. I had just decided to go back to the cafe and see if anyone had a number for the cab firm when I felt a light tap on my shoulder.
You're either running like the wind or crawling at a glacial pace because you're weighed down with bags, laughed Mr. Helpful. I never know which version of you I'm going to run into. You're a woman of extremes.
What can I say? I told him. At least I'm not predictable.
You're certainly not that. I don't suppose you fancy a drink, he offered, nodding over to the pub.
It's a bit early, isn't it?
A bite of lunch in the cafe, then?
All right, I said, resigned to the fact that I wasn't getting back to the farm any time soon. Thank you. I was actually just heading over there to see my friend.
Yet again our planets seem to have aligned,
he said, flashing me a smile before taking some of the bags. I didn't point out that he had suggested the pub while I had been aiming for the cafe. Back again so soon, Gemma said to me. There's a table just about to clear in the far corner, if you don't mind waiting. The place was still so busy, I thought we were lucky to get seated at all. Everything all right? Asked Beck as she rushed over. She was talking to me, but very definitely looking at my companion. Do you want me to put your bags in the car? She offered when she finally dragged her gaze back to me. I've got fridge stuff in this one, I said, holding it up. I'll ask Gemma if there's room in the storeroom fridge. It isn't used for business supplies, so it should be all right. She disappeared with all of the bags, and the guy I still only knew as Mr. Helpful and I squeezed around the tiny table.
I take it you've already been in here today, he asked. Gemma obviously knows you.
I popped in earlier, I told him, but I'm happy to be back again. The food was amazing.
It always is,
he said, handing me a lunch menu. You know, I still don't know your name, I said, feeling suddenly self-conscious.
It's Anthony, he grinned. Anthony Judd.
Anthony, I repeated. I'm pleased to meet you, properly at last. And I'm...
Fliss, he interrupted. Felicity Brown.
I couldn't ask immediately how he'd found that out, because an older lady wearing a cupcake-patterned apron came over to take our order. So, how do you know my name? I asked the second she'd gone. I've hardly announced myself to the town. Was it Beck? I hardly thought it would have come from Grandad's friend at the library, or the doctor, or Vicky, and Elliot and Louise certainly wouldn't have said anything. Beck, however, did have something of a track record now.
You needn't sound so put out, he laughed. There aren't any secrets around here, and no, it wasn't your friend.
I wondered if he'd heard anything else about me other than my name from whoever he'd talked to. With Grandad still coming to terms with what had happened to Mum, I didn't like the thought of her demise being town gossip. She might have left a long time ago, but there were bound to be people around who still remembered her, as well as her dramatic exit.
And you aren't squatting at Fenview Farm, Anthony carried on. You're staying there with your grandfather, who you've only just met.
I was flabbergasted. How do you know that? I demanded, frustrated with trying to puzzle it out. I never reveal my sources, he whispered, flashing me what he no doubt thought was another winning smile. But it didn't win me.
Oh dear,
he said, the smile vanishing when he realised I wasn't impressed.
I've upset you.
No, you haven't, I said. It's fine. I just don't like being the subject of gossip.
I didn't mean to speak out of turn, he quickly said, and there was no gossiping. You are Fliss Brown, aren't you?
Yes.
So why the cloak and dagger? Don't you want anyone to know?
No, I said, not yet. As you pointed out, I've only just arrived, and I was hoping to settle in and get to know Grandad and the farm before I was subjected to local scrutiny. As he hadn't mentioned Mum, I didn't either.
In that case, he said, I'm very sorry.
I don't suppose it really matters, I told him, doing my best not to sound upset. You just took me by surprise, that's all. With a farm to run, I knew it would have been impossible to stay under the radar and keep my identity a secret for long, and therefore there didn't seem to be much point in staying cross with Anthony, even though he had caught me off guard. It had been just the same in the small town closest to the farm in Puglia. No one passed through there without being noticed, and I guessed it was the same in Winbridge. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it did make me feel a bit exposed, sitting in the busy cafe, eating lunch with a handsome stranger.
Sure? He asked, sounding genuinely concerned.
Yes, I sighed. I'm sure. Word was bound to get around, wasn't it?
Afraid so, he agreed, but I won't tell anyone.
We'll just leave it to the Winbridge grapevine, shall we? I suggested.
Exactly,
he smiled. After lunch, he offered to drop me back at the farm so I wouldn't have to ring for a taxi or wait until Beck finished. She gave me a knowing look as she handed me back my bags of shopping.
I don't blame you, swapping the banana-mobile for Mr. Helpful, she grinned. It's not like that, I tutted. He said he's heading that way anyway.
Yeah, right, she snorted. And his name's Anthony.
Ooh, she said, progress.
Well, I could hardly have lunch with him and not ask his name, could I said, returning her reaction with an eye roll.
I suppose not,
she agreed.
Thank you for the lift earlier, and would you thank Gemma for me when you get a chance?
Oh, yes, said Beck. What were you two talking about earlier? I hope I didn't put my foot in it saying who you were. If supplying fruit for the cafe came off, then she would have definitely done the farm a favour. But I wasn't going to tell her what her boss had in mind. I needed to talk to Grandad first. It wouldn't be professional to go talking about the deal even before it was done.
I meant, would you thank her for the pastries? That was all.
Yeah, right, Beck said again, though that time without the accompanying snort. It was mid-afternoon when I arrived back at the farm, and I was worried I'd left Grandad for too long. If only I had my own transport, I would be able to make much shorter trips to town.
Looks like you've got company,
said Anthony as he swung into the drive. Elliot's Ducati was parked up, and my heart skipped at the sight of it. Then I began to panic. Had he popped in to pay a random social visit, or had Grandad called him because he'd had a fall? My heart thrummed all the harder as I fumbled to get out of the car.
Are you all right?
Anthony asked. Yes, I nodded. Of course. Let's get the bags. I swiftly shifted them from the boot to the back door, said a speedy thank you and goodbye, and rushed inside. Anthony looked rather taken aback by my hasty dismissal, but didn't appear inclined to hang about either. In fact, he'd driven off almost before I'd crossed the kitchen. The sound of laughter met my ears, and I let out the breath I hadn't realised I'd been holding.
Felicity,
smiled Grandad when he looked up and saw me in the doorway.
We've got company.
So I see, I beamed, looking from him to Elliot. My heart carried on thumping just as fast, but I tried to kid myself that was because I was relieved that Grandad was all right and not because Elliot looked and smelt even more delicious than I remembered.
I've just given him a demo of how we've been negotiating the stairs, said Grandad.
Hello, Fliss, said Elliot, returning my smile with one of his own.
I hear you've been doing brilliantly.
We've been managing,
I shyly said. Crikey, at this rate I'd be swaying from side to side and batting my lashes. I had thought I'd begun to get the measure of my attraction for him, but that was obviously only because I hadn't seen him. Now, faced with the handsome and sensually scented reality, I had to acknowledge I had it every bit as bad as before. I'd just had lunch with a devastatingly good-looking, well-turned-out and intriguing man, and yet my reaction to him hadn't been anything like the one induced by the sight of Elliot.
More than managing, he quickly said, just as I knew you would.
I'd better get these bags unpacked, I swallowed, not wanting to give my overwhelming feelings away. There's stuff that needs to go in the fridge.
How did you get on at Anderson's? Grandad called after me.
Really well. Everything's coming on Monday. It's quite a place, isn't it?
It is. Did they let you put it all on the account?
Oh, I fibbed. I didn't think to ask if you had one. I paid for it all there and then.
In that case, we'll settle up later.
I went to mention Gemma's business proposition, but stopped myself. I really wanted to give it a bit more thought before I presented it. I should have picked up a notebook in town. Writing things down always helped me get a bit of perspective, as well as sparking off other ideas. The rain clouds had gathered again, and I was getting the washing in when Elliot left.
I hope you haven't stayed out of the way on my account,
he said, zipping himself into his suit. I thought it would be good for you and Grandad to have a bit of time, I said, rather than admitting the truth, which was that I didn't trust my hormones whenever I was around him. He's really missed you.
I've missed him too, he told me, and you, but I really have been busy with work.
So much for your holiday, I said, trying not to get carried away with the thought of him missing me.
I know, he tutted, and my timing could have been better today, because Bill said it was the first time he'd been alone in ages. I'm sure he had been enjoying the peace.
None the more for that. I bet he was thrilled to see you. I said, picking up the washing basket. I know I am.
Are you now?
He grinned.
Yes,
I swallowed.
In that case,
He said, running a hand through his hair before pulling on his gloves.
I'll try not to leave it so long before I come back again. Bill talked a bit about your mum earlier. He seems to be getting his head around it all. How are you doing?
I loved that, like Beck, he didn't skirt around the issue as some people might. Not brilliant, but better than I was, I told him, returning his frankness with my own. I appreciate you asking.
That's what friends are for.
Friends, I reminded myself as I watched him pull on his helmet and start the bike. Elliot Randall and I were friends and destined to remain so. He turned in the seat and gave me a wave before he drove off. I nodded back because I was holding the laundry. What about friends with benefits? I wondered.
End of CD 4.